first nor the last person who has wanted to lash out at Arya. You never answered my question, she reminded him softly, and his lips twitched up. I thought it would bother me, he said, but whatever the truth is, whoever your parents are, I don't care. Perhaps I should, but I don't, not now that you're here and I'm coming to know you. I will never make any secret of the fact that I despise your mother, but I know that you are nothing like her. I'm sorry to speak ill of your family in your presence, and I will try and refrain from it. Whatever they did to me, they are your kin and you doubtless have love for them. I will try and remember to consider that, as you will have to try and make allowances and considerations for Arya's lack of tact. Or her outright rudeness, in this case. I will have a word with her, Myrcella. I am not ignorant to the fact that people talk, and I know that you aren't either, but you should not have to face it from someone who will soon be kin to you. Thank you, Rob, truly, thank you, she nodded her head vigorously, still determined not to let the tears fall. There is no need to thank me, it is the least I can do, he said warmly, and she managed a smile for him, though the corners of her mouth twitched painfully with the effort. A letter came for you today, he continued, letting go of her hands so he could reach into his cloak to pull it out. Perhaps I could escort you back to the keep and you can read it in peace, he suggested, and she nodded, taking the letter he outstretched to her. He offered his arm once she had taken it, and she lay her hand on his forearm, falling into step with him as they crossed to the keep. As they walked, she turned the letter in her hand and glanced down at the seal. It was the royal seal and it was shiny and unbroken. A tiny smile graced her lips as she took in the sight, and she felt incredibly foolish for ever doubting he would deliver it to her unopened. Chapter 9:8, The First Snow. Notes. New chapter for you all. Thank you for all the kudos, and to those who left comments, it is much appreciated. Especially to Purpley Ann, I'm sorry I made you cry real tears, but I'm so glad you're enjoying it. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Rob. Rob smiled slightly as he leaned against the open doorway, his eyes keen as he watched Sansa rearranging Rhea's blankets around her before stepping closer to Myrcella. His soon-to-be wife seemed to hesitate a little, and he saw the slight shake in her hands as Sansa offered the baby to her. He could well understand her fear, he had been terrified when Sansa had first come to Winterfell to present Bethany to them. His niece had been so tiny that he had been afraid he might break her. She was not so tiny now, as she stamped around the nursery swinging one of her dolls rather more violently than he felt was necessary. His mother had called him ridiculous, reminding him that he had held all of his own siblings as babies. Rob was sure she was right, but he only really remembered holding Bran and Rickon, perhaps a vague memory of Arya. He had been a child then though, and he knew well enough that children did not have the same fears as grown men and women. His eyes moved from Bethany and back to Myrcella as Sansa shifted Rhea into her arms, again rearranging some of the blankets. It was a subconscious thing she did, Rob knew well enough. All mothers he had seen did the same whenever the weather grew colder. Myrcella adjusted her grip slightly on the baby, and he could see how terrified she was from the way her body stiffened. Just relax, Sansa advised her softly, she is only young. She won't try and wriggle out of your arms just yet. Rob knew that Sansa had been trying to soothe her with the words, but if anything Myrcella looked even more terrified. They do that? She asked in a slightly strangled voice, and Rob had to bite back a laugh. Rob almost dropped Bethany once Sansa told her in an amused tone, and he scowled. I did not, he said indignantly, and the two women snapped their heads towards him at once. What's this? Oliver's voice came behind him. Are you talking about the time Rob almost dropped Beth? Oliver clapped him on the back as he skirted round him to enter the nursery. I did not, Rob protested again as Sansa laughed. He narrowed his eyes at her, but looked away swiftly as Oliver moved to greet her with a kiss. His old squire was one of his greatest friends, and he was truly pleased that his sister had found love and happiness. However, that did not mean that he enjoyed seeing them being amorous with one another. Arya teased him mercilessly about it, asking him how he imagined two daughters had been delivered to their sister. She had been avoiding him recently though, no doubt she was trying to avoid Myrcella. He was still irked with her for what she had said to his betrothed, and he had told her never to speak to her in such a way again. Arya had been unimpressed, and had barely spoken 2 words to him since. I know you mean well, Arya, but you cannot speak to her that way. She is a princess, and she deserves your respect at the very least, he scolded her. I am not asking you to like her. I am not even asking you to spend any time with her. I am merely asking you to hold your tongue, please, for me. Arya stared up at him, the expression in her eyes almost murderous. Princess, she repeated mockingly. Gods, she really has got you right where she wants you, hasn't she, Rob? What happened to you? Have you just forgotten about everything that happened due to the Lannisters because she has pretty hair and looks nice in a dress? His own gaze turned cold at that, and he glared at his younger sister. It matters not who her parents are, I have judged her on her own character, he snarled at her, and I will not warn you again. Leave Myrcella alone, she is not to be held accountable for the crimes of others. Are you all right, Rob? Sansa's voice snapped him out of his daze and he smiled for her, nodding faintly. I was just thinking, that's all he said reassuringly, and she returned his smile. I expect you have much to think about, Mother was asking me for thoughts on the wedding feast. Is there anything that either of you have a specific preference for? Sansa looked between Rob and Myrcella expectantly. Oh, I will eat most things. I would hate for any unnecessary trouble to be gone to, Myrcella spoke up, her eyes flickering between him and Sansa. While he and Myrcella had fallen into a rather easy friendship, they very rarely made any mention of their coming nuptials. They could hardly avoid the notion forever. The ceremony was set to take place a mere week from now. I hope you have not been giving Mother ideas, Rob sighed heavily. If I hear any more talk about 16 courses I will ban you from helping her. 16. Oliver repeated. What did we have? 4, he looked at Sansa for her answer. Yes, she confirmed, though our wedding did take place in the depths of winter. Oliver murmured his agreement at that, his attention caught by Bethany pulling on the ties of his boot. And mine and Myrcella's wedding is taking place as winter is about to set in again. I told her, 8 is my limit, even that is too much if you ask me, Rob said with a roll of his eyes, and Sansa smirked at him. Tommen had 38, Myrcella said quietly, and they all turned to stare at her. 38. Oliver and Rob repeated in a scandalized tone, Sansa biting down on her lip to no doubt stop herself from laughing. It was in the summer, Myrcella defended at once, we weren't to know then how brief it was going to be. 38. Oliver repeated again. And did you sample all of them? His good brother's tone was almost longing and Rob rolled his eyes, sharing a knowing look with Sansa. Not all of them, Myrcella smiled, over half though, I would wager. But only a little from each. It does no good for a lady to overindulge, or so Etta used to tell me anyway. She glanced towards Rob then, and he could see her features beginning to relax. No doubt she had been on edge when the talk of their wedding had been sprung upon them. He hoped it was only because she was worried about he would react to it, and not because she herself were dreading it. A royal wedding, Rob. Perhaps you ought to up your number, Oliver grinned at him and he rolled his eyes. Ah yes, but my future good brother rules over 6 regions, I myself can only claim 2, he said in an amused tone. Then what is a quarter of 38? Sansa asked, a slight frown creasing her brow. 9, Myrcella answered, and a half she added, grinning at Rob as he shot her a dark look. We may as well round that to 10, Oliver said matter-of-factly, and Rob huffed at him. Or we can just keep it to 8, Myrcella smiled, I think we have teased him enough for one day. Rob sent her a grateful look and she inclined her head slightly. Her attention was caught from him as Rhea began to grumble in her arms, a fleeting look of panic crossing her features before she rocked the baby slightly, hushing her gently. Rob smiled slightly as his younger niece began to quiet again. I don't know what you were worried about, Sansa directed towards Myrcella, you are a natural. Thank you, Myrcella smiled widely at Sansa before her attention went back to Rhea. Sansa in turn looked towards Rob and sent him a knowing look. He smiled slightly, knowing well enough what the look was for. No doubt their mother had told Sansa all about the terrible things he had uttered about Myrcella and their future children. It still made him cringe to remember them, beyond ashamed at how hateful he had been. It seemed impossible now, as he gazed at Myrcella intently, to think that it had not been that long ago that he had harbored such deep resentment towards her. Oliver, he spoke up, remembering something, I am glad we're all here together, there is something I would ask of you should Myrcella be agreeable. Anything, Oliver said easily, and Rob smiled at him. I wondered if you would be the one to escort Myrcella to the Godswood. By tradition it ought to be her father, but obviously that is impossible. In his place it ought to be a member of my own family. Rukan is too shy to conduct what is necessary, and Bran is unable, though I know if he were he would be more than willing. He nodded towards Myrcella at that point, seeing her incline her head in response. It doesn't seem right to ask my mother or sisters, so I wondered if you would be willing. Of course, it would be my honor. Oliver bowed his head between the pair of them. If the princess is willing, of course, Oliver continued, and all eyes moved to Myrcella. Of course I am, thank you, she said gratefully, and the two of them shared a smile. Robb himself was relieved. He had thought to ask one of his lords when they began to arrive, but he wasn't sure how any of them would take it. If his bride had been anyone else, then he imagined they would see it as a great honor. With it being Myrcella though, well, imagining the look on Lord Karstark's face had been enough to persuade him against that particular idea. Oliver made sense. He was a Sir and a member of Robb's own family. He had also spent enough time with Myrcella to know her true nature, and doubtless she herself would be more comfortable with him than being escorted by one of his lords that she was yet to meet. You are wise beyond your years, do you know that? Robb smiled as he and Myrcella ambled along the gravel path. What makes you say that? She asked him curiously, a hint of a smile playing about her own lips. I sometimes forget how young you are, younger even than Arya, when I speak to you. He tailed off, suddenly uncertain of what he should say. You what? She prompted him curiously, nudging him in the ribs slightly with her elbow. Her action made him grin. She was becoming far less proper with him by the day. Your courtesies are deserting you more and more with each passing day, he commented with a smirk, and she giggled lightly. Perhaps I am turning savage, she said teasingly, to which it was his turn to laugh. Do not change the subject, she chided him after a moment of quiet. What were you going to say? I don't know if I have the right words, he confessed to her, and she slowed her steps so they both came to a halt. You told me that you didn't have a pretty way with words, and I told you I would prefer honest ones, remember? She arched one brow in the way that she seemed to reserve just for him, the sight of it making him smile slightly. I can imagine the queen you will be, he said after considering her for a long moment. I do not think you will be content to sit beside me and smile serenely. You have strong opinions, and I do not want to repress them. Both her brows were raised at that, and she opened and closed her mouth a few times before she seemed to find a reply to him. What does that mean? That you would consider my counsel? She asked him, an almost hopeful look shining in her eyes. If you want honest words from me, then I want the same from you. On all matters, whether they be personal to the pair of us, to our family, or if they concern the kingdoms. Don't ever be afraid to speak your mind. I may not always like it, but I won't ever command you not to, he promised her, his hand finding hers. This time she slowly moved her hand so that her fingers could lace with his, and he swallowed hard. He didn't remember them standing this close before, facing one another with a mere inch between them. Her breath had quickened, he could see it in the air as the temperature was so cold now. His own appeared to be stuck in his throat, even though his heart was hammering against his chest. Slowly he leaned in closer. Only an inch, to gauge her reaction. She didn't pull away, if anything she leaned in a fraction more. He licked his lips nervously, seeing her own part slightly as though in anticipation. He vaguely wondered if a man had ever kissed her before. His own stomach was clenched tightly as though it was his first time all over again. Just as he had made his mind up to just lean in and press his lips to hers, he heard his mother's exasperated shout coming from the other side of the gardens. With a sigh he pulled back slightly, glancing back towards Myrcella and seeing that she had averted her eyes. In the next moment she slipped her hand from his grasp, moving it back to settle on his arm. He was irritated at that, his hand feeling oddly colder without the contact of her soft skin. There you are, his mother sounded half relieved and half irritated. Sansa is waiting with the seamstress, your dress is ready, she directed toward Myrcella. Oh. Myrcella put her free hand to her forehead. Of course, it is today, I plain forgot, my lady, I am so sorry. There is no matter, just run along there now, I will join you in a moment, his mother said kindly, and Myrcella slipped her hand from his arm. I will see you at dinner, she met his eyes, and he inclined his head, an amused smile twitching at his lips as he could almost see her forcing herself not to drop into a curtsy. When it was just the two of them she was never formal anymore, but as soon as his mother was around she seemed to want to revert back to all her southern courtesies. See you at dinner, he replied, and she gave him a swift smile and bowed her head before picking up her skirts slightly and half running in the direction of the keep. You put her on edge, Rob told his mother in an amused tone. I don't mean to, his mother replied, and he grinned. I know you don't, he chuckled, offering her the arm Ursula had just dropped. Did I interrupt you? She asked knowingly as they resumed the walk he had been intending to enjoy with his future wife. We were just going for a turn around the gardens, he replied simply, and she hummed in a rather suspicious manner. Ursula had quite the blush on her cheeks, she commented, and he rolled his eyes. It will be the chill in the air, he said dismissively, and he could have sworn his mother snorted slightly. Nothing happened, he said indignantly, to which his mother hummed again. Would it have? If I had not interrupted you, she needled at him, and he huffed in an irritable manner. I don't really know if I want to have this conversation with you, he said pointedly, but she seemed unperturbed. Rob, I am your mother, she scoffed, you have never been able to lie to me. I am 24, he reminded her, and she squeezed his arm affectionately. Yes, you are a man grown, and a king too, but I am still your mother. Talk to me, she commanded him, and he sighed in defeat. I had thought to kiss her, he finally admitted, refusing to look at his mother. He just knew that there would be a triumphant expression on her face. Indeed, she said simply, but he could hear the underlying smugness in her tone. I do not want to hear it, he warned her, though he couldn't quite keep the trace of amusement from his own voice. Hear what? She asked him innocently. I told you so, he replied simply. I am just glad that you have given her a chance, his mother said seriously, and even more glad that the two of you are getting on so well. I know it won't always be easy, but you're both doing wonderfully. I see you together sometimes and I can almost imagine that the two of you are a love match, rather than a political one. Rob turned and narrowed his eyes at her slightly at that. Do not get ahead of yourself, he muttered. Yes, he enjoyed Ursula's company. And yes, as a man, he desired her. How could he not? But love. That was something else entirely. Oh, you know what I mean, his mother said exasperatedly, and he shook his head. I enjoy spending time with her, and I am sure she will make a pleasing wife and queen, but that is all I can allow at this moment, mother, he told her, unable to stop the slightly warning tones creeping in. That is far more than you had even considered even a moon ago, she reminded him, and he nodded his agreement. I know, he voiced it, and I know you were right. I should never have judged her before I met her, it only serves to make me guiltier the more I come to know her. His mother patted his arm affectionately in response. It takes a real man to admit his mistakes, she said, and I have no doubt that you have made your apology to her. Leave it in the past where it belongs. In only a few days you will be husband and wife, make your wedding day a real fresh start and forget all of the apprehension and the ugly words that have been spoken. I will, he vowed, but the apprehension and ugly words have not been all my own. His mother sighed heavily at that, and he knew that she had understood his meaning. Arya, she said in a tired manner, and he nodded his agreement. I wonder if she will even come to the wedding, he muttered, and his mother applied more pressure to his arm. She is your sister, whatever feelings she has towards Ursula she will put them aside and support you, Rob, I am sure of it, she said with conviction, and Rob wished he could believe her. Are you? He asked skeptically. Arya is as stubborn as a mule. Both your father and I could be on occasion, she appears to have taken the tray from both of us. I sometimes wonder if her being out in the wilds away from us for so long took more of a toll on her than she would have us believe. She certainly harbors more resentment inside her than the rest of us. I know you had your fair share, she nodded towards him, and he inclined his head. But she continued, you somehow found it inside you to accept Tywin's deal. You got some kind of peace from Joffrey's death. Some justice. Just as Sansa did, as I did, but Arya still seems to lust after more. She is vengeful still, Rob, sometimes so much so that she scares me with it. And to her, Ursula is just a symbol of everything she has despised for so long. But she loves you, and she will not spoil your day, I will make sure of that. Where are we going? I thought you were escorting me back to my chamber. Ursula sounded simultaneously excited and suspicious, and he smiled slightly. I was going to, he confirmed, but then something outside caught my eye, and I'd like you to see it. She hummed suspiciously, reminding him eerily of his mother out in the gardens earlier in the day. How was your dress? I never got the chance to ask you at dinner, you were so busy gossiping with Sangza and my mother, he said exasperatedly, and she turned her head and narrowed her eyes at him. I was not gossiping, she said indignantly, we were merely speaking about the wedding and how much there still is to prepare. But my dress was fine, only minor adjustments needed. Good, he smiled, I cannot wait to see you in it. He took himself aback with the sincerity of his words, and he saw Ursula's eyes widen in barely disguised surprise. And what about you? She asked as they waited for the guards to let them out of the keep. Will you be wearing your usual black or will you be wearing something with a little color? She asked him with that arched brow, and he couldn't help but chuckle. Would you have me in bright colors and adorned with jewels when we are married, princess? He asked her mockingly, and she scowled at him. A little color would do you no harm. What about blue? It would go with your eyes, she suggested, and he snorted slightly. I'm sure, he said dryly, leading her through the doors which the guards held open for them. For the wedding I had thought to wear grey, as a Stark. He inclined his head and she smiled. And my mother insisted I ought to at least match your cloak. He rolled his eyes at her and she laughed. Her laughter cut off though as they left the keep, and he turned to see her eyes wide again. The first real snow of the winter. He gestured out into the night air where snowflakes were falling slowly from the sky. It's so beautiful, she said wonderingly, reaching her hand out to catch one of the flakes as they descended the steps. You act as though you have never seen it before, he chuckled, and she slapped his arm lightly in response. I have never seen it like this before, she said wonderingly, the snow we had at the capital was always so light and powdery. This is real snow. She slipped her hand from his arm and walked several steps in front of him, outstretching one of her hands to catch another flake. Rob couldn't help but watch her intently as she brought her hand closer to her face to examine the flake. Will it settle? She asked him almost longingly. Do you wish it to? He asked in response, and she turned and smiled sheepishly at him. Not forever, she elaborated, it's just, mother never allowed us to go out during the winter. Not properly at least. Tommen and I were never allowed to play in the snow, though we saw other children out there. They would build forts and throw snowballs at one another from behind them. We may have done that. Rob grinned at her and she beamed back at him. And Rukan, bless him and his patience, built 6 dire wolves from it out in the gardens. They stood there for a good week, until more flurries came and made them unrecognizable. Ursula's smile only widened at that, and she came back towards him, her eyes wide and shining. Why have you never introduced me to Grey Wind? She asked him tentatively, cocking her head to one side. I didn't know you had a desire to meet him, he answered her, and she frowned slightly. He's important to you, she said pointedly, and I have only ever seen glimpses of him around the grounds. At first, I suppose I didn't want you to share him with me, he admitted to her, seeing her expression more understanding than hurt. And now, she pressed him gently. And now I know you better, and I see no reason why you shouldn't be introduced. If you would really like to be, he smiled at her, seeing her return the gesture easily. I would, she said simply, and he reached out for her hand. Then perhaps he can accompany us on our walk tomorrow. Our final walk unmarried, she observed, and he swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of her hand in his. Indeed, he agreed, his mouth suddenly incredibly dry. She said nothing else, and neither did he, simply brushing his thumb lightly up and down the skin on the back of her hand. It seemed to calm his pounding heart enough for him to be able to meet her eyes once more. I see you have still not had any gloves made, he rolled his eyes at her. My hand is perfectly warm, she returned, mimicking his gesture. And what of the other one? He enquired, holding his other hand out for it. She placed it in his with a sigh and he grinned at her. Not quite frozen yet, he remarked, and she shook her head at him. He merely grinned again before bringing her hand further towards him and bending his head to press his lips to the back of it. That was very courteous of you, Your Grace, she said teasingly when he raised his head again. It saved me from doing something rather uncourteous, he returned before he could stop himself, seeing a blush rise up on her cheeks even in the darkness. That same uncourteous thing your mother stopped you from doing out in the gardens? She asked him, her voice barely more than a whisper. The very same, he returned, dropping one of her hands and hesitantly moving his fingers to stroke gently down her cheek. I wouldn't mind, she told him, her cheeks even more flushed. He smiled in response before allowing the tips of his middle finger and his forefinger to rest on her lower lip. I'm glad, he said, smiling widely at her, but as tempting as you are, I will resist until we are joined under the heart tree. I cannot give you any more reasons to name me a savage. Chapter 10, 9, One Final Day. Notes. New chapter. The wedding is creeping closer, but not quite upon us yet. I will be posting a short interlude chapter from the capital midweek, and the actual wedding chapter next weekend as usual, so you won't have to wait too long for it. Thanks to everyone who left kudos, and to those who commented. I believe one of you asked about John. Yes, he will be making an appearance, but not for a while yet, I'm afraid. Anyway, thank you all so much. Hope you enjoy this chapter. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Mercila. As tempting as you are, I will resist until we are joined under the heart tree. I cannot give you any more reasons to name me a savage. Mercila woke up with a lazy smile and Rob's words still resounding in her head. She bit down on her lip, knowing that it was probably very wrong of her to feel so pleased with herself that Rob found her tempting. It was probably even more wrong of her to wish that he had ignored propriety and kissed her. No man had ever kissed her before, not on the lips at any rate. She had been kissed on the hand more times than she could even think of putting a number to. She had even had kisses placed on her cheeks by family members. Her lips though, no man had ever come close. Not until Rob. Without thinking she ran her fingertips over her bottom lip, remembering how feeling him do the same the night before had made them tingle. She sighed, kicking the furs away from her and swinging her legs over the side of the bed. As much as she wanted to, she knew she could not lay in her bed all morning thinking about Rob and what he may or may not feel for her. Her own feelings were all jumbled and muddled, what she was feeling in her heart was clashing awfully with the warnings from her mother. If he thinks you care for him, then he has power over you, more power than he will gain from visiting your bed night after night. Mercila shuddered as she made her way to the dresser, her mother's words now drowning out Rob's. Surely she couldn't be right. She was just preparing Mercila for the worst, for what she assumed Rob would be and how he would feel about taking a Lannister bride. Mercila knew better now though, didn't she? She was actually here spending time with him, getting to know him and letting him know her. He will know all of me come tomorrow night. She shuddered again, but she wasn't entirely sure whether it was with fear or not. Yes, she certainly felt some level of apprehension when she thought of her wedding night, but at the same time she could not help but think about how Rob's skin felt when he held her hand. Or how he had made her lips tingle with just a mere whisper of his touch. Was this what he wanted? For her to feel this way? To lull her into a false sense of security and affection only to crush all of her tentative hopes as soon as he took her as his wife? She shook her head. No. No, Rob would not do that. Rob was not like that. She was letting her mother's words get to her. Her mother didn't know the first thing about Rob. Mercila could not claim to know everything, but she knew enough to know that her mother was wrong. She had to be. Mercila did not even want to consider the alternative. Not now. A knock came at the door just as she began to fasten the ties of her dress, and she worked her fingers faster in response. Just a moment, she called out, finishing the ties before glancing quickly into the mirror. Her hair was a bit of a tangled mess, but there was not much she could do about it now. It would be rude to keep her guest waiting any longer. She hurried to the door and pulled it open, starting slightly on seeing Rob on the other side. Breakfast, he smiled, holding out a plate laden with food to her. Her stomach snarled in response and she smiled apologetically at him. It seems I have come just in time, he said, skirting around her and crossing to lay the plate down atop her table. You best eat before it gets cold, he advised her. Would you object to company? Ordinarily, no, she said, biting down on her lip gently as she thought of what whispering maids might say if they caught them leaving her chamber together. We can leave the door open, if it would make you more comfortable, Rob suggested with a raised brow, and she nodded sheepishly before crossing to take a seat. He moved to her side table and set about pouring them both a glass of wine as Mercila started on her breakfast. Once he was out of sight, she felt she could explain it better to him. You don't make me feel uncomfortable, she assured him. You never have, not once we agreed upon our fresh start anyway. It's just others, they talk, and I think enough whispers are spoken about me without whore being added to the list. Anyone who names you whore, or anything else for that matter, will find themselves in stocks, Rob practically growled, and a glass of wine was set down at the side of her plate in the next moment. You will not put them all in stocks, you would not have enough, she told him wryly, expecting him to laugh. He didn't. He just gazed at her so intently that she forgot all about being hungry. I will make enough, he told her seriously, and as ridiculous as his statement was, she could not help but believe him. You will make yourself unpopular, she told him just as seriously. I don't care, he returned, and she smiled slightly. You ought to, she sighed, turning her attention to the wine he had poured her. You will only make it worse if you become a tyrant after taking me as your wife, she said. It isn't you they'll blame. It will be me. Eat your breakfast, he said softly, you are worrying too much about this. The people cannot resist a wedding, and they will be able to resist your beauty and your goodness even less. You won me over, Myrcella, I have no doubt that you can win them over as well. Myrcella merely smiled faintly before obediently continuing on with her breakfast. Truthfully, she did not think it would quite as easy as Rob was making it out to be. Either he was underestimating how difficult life might become for him with her as his queen. Or, more likely, he was trying to soothe her own worries by being wildly unrealistic. She decided to let it go either way, for now at least. Likely the issue would crop up again in the near future, but Myrcella hoped that she would at least be allowed to enjoy her wedding day first. Never had she thought she would look forward to the day. Be happy and excited about exchanging vows with the man her grandfather had bargained her to all those years ago. She had expected a day of false smiles and false courtesies. Now she knew that her smiles would be genuine, and she had secret hopes that Rob's would be too. She swallowed down another mouthful of breakfast before contemplating him, seeing an amused smile twitching at one corner of his mouth. Go on, he raised a brow expectantly at her. I can tell that you're dying to ask me something, come on, out with it, he implored her, and she couldn't help but smile. Are you looking forward to tomorrow, she asked him after taking a steadying breath. I am, he responded, I didn't think I ever would, but I am. I promise you. Now eat up. We are supposed to be meeting Grey Wind in the gardens and he is a rather impatient beast. They ambled easily through the gardens, Rob calling out for his wolf every moment or so. He didn't appear, and Myrcella tried to push away the uneasy feeling the animal was watching them. Watching her, more specifically. She tightened her grip on Rob's arm slightly as he called out for Grey Wind once more. This time there was a rustling in the wilder undergrowth which lined the southern wall of the gardens. Slowly the dire wolf appeared, his yellow eyes the most prominent feature of his great, hulking form. By the gods! Myrcella had seen him before at a distance, but this was something else entirely. She swallowed hard, but it was a difficult motion as her mouth had gone suddenly dry. Grey Wind came closer, padding along the grass in an almost lazy fashion, coming to a halt a mere foot from Rob and dropping down onto his haunches at his master's side. Rob moved his free hand to rest on the wolf's head, and Grey Wind's eyes turned to Myrcella. It seemed ridiculous to think it, but she had honestly never seen an animal look so smug and content. Grey Wind, this is Myrcella, Rob introduced, though it did not sound ridiculous. Especially when the wolf looked up at Rob before moving his eyes back to Myrcella and blinking slowly at her. Hello, Grey Wind, she said tentatively, flickering her eyes to Rob and seeing him incline his head slightly. Say hello, then Rob moved his hand to pat Grey Wind's shoulder encouragingly, eliciting a whine from the wolf. The dire wolf rose again, with surprising grace for one so big, and moved towards Myrcella. He sniffed around the hem of her skirts before circling her, bumping Rob out of the way as he did so. Myrcella was now left grasping air as Rob's arm was pushed out of her grip. For a second she was panicked, but the wolf stopped his circling and came to a halt in front of her. Again, he settled down on his haunches, raising his head almost as though he wanted to meet her eyes. Myrcella took a breath and outstretched her hand slowly. Grey Wind whined, and she hoped that it was not in warning. She imagined Rob would warn her if he thought his wolf were about to savagely attack her, and so she kept on. An inch away the wolf seemed to lose patience, moving his head forward so it butted against her hand. Another whine escaped him and she laughed shakily, stroking him properly now and smiling widely when he nuzzled his head against her hand. You have a friend for life now, Rob said in an amused tone, and Myrcella turned her head to him. I do hope so, she said, hoping that he would understand the double meaning. His smile seemed to brighten his eyes a little more in response, and so she imagined that he may well have done. She had often thought Rob to be very astute, just like his mother in that regard. "Now, will you allow us to continue our walk?" Rob directed towards his wolf, stepping closer to Ursula again and placing a hand on the small of her back. She almost jumped at the contact, but she was glad that she hadn't. Likely Rob would imagine she didn't want his touch, when in reality she was glad of the pressure. It was all she could do not to lean back against him, already imagining him wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her against his chest. She let her breath out slowly, seeing Grey Wind staring at her intently, almost as though he knew exactly what she had just imagined in her head. "Would you join us, Grey Wind, or do you have more pressing engagements in the Wolf's Wood?" Rob asked, and Ursula couldn't help but laugh slightly as Grey Wind cocked his head to one side as though he were considering Rob's words. He yapped twice after a moment, rising to his feet again and waiting in an expectant manner. "I think he's joining us," Rob said, moving his hand from her back to offer his arm again. Ursula took it gladly and they set off in step, Grey Wind trotting at her side for a little while before he raced on ahead to sniff at anything and everything that caught his fancy. "Do you think he understands everything you say?" Ursula asked curiously as they ambled after his inquisitive wolf. "I don't know if he understands every word," Rob said, "it is more like he can read my mind than anything else. There is some kind of connection between us, I cannot deny that. It was on the battlefield when I noticed it the most, and where it came in most useful. Whenever someone got the best of me in a fight he would appear, the odds would always turn in my favor then." "I cannot imagine him in battle," Ursula said honestly, her hand gripping a little tighter on Rob's forearm as she said it. "He is a different beast," Rob replied, and she nodded her agreement. Watching Grey Wind was like watching an overgrown pup milling about the place. "Did he help you with the dragon?" Ursula asked, finally plucking up the courage to mention his most famed victory. They had spoken often about the war, and Rob had relayed many tales to her, but never that one. He never spoke much of the war beyond the wall either, though for that Ursula was rather grateful. He made a nuisance of himself, distracted the great thing more than anything, Rob told her, and she nodded slowly. "Is it true you were injured?" she asked. "I do not think a man could take down a dragon without sustaining some kind of injury," he responded, and she tilted her head to look up at him. I suppose she agreed with him, now unable to stop thinking of the scars that marred him that she was yet to see. "I will see them soon enough. I will know all of him, as he will know all of me." "It wasn't quite as horrific as the tales will tell you," Rob told her, as though he knew exactly what she was thinking. "It matters not to me, scars are a sign of bravery and sacrifice. They show that a man is willing to fight to protect what is his," Ursula said seriously, and his brows raised slightly in response. "There you go again, sounding wise beyond your years." "How did you get so wise, if I might ask?" he said quietly, and she smiled at him. "I read a lot of books," she told him, and he chuckled in response. "That must be where I am going wrong, I have not the time nor the patience for reading. Nothing is ever placed before me that isn't related to the kingdoms," he sighed. "You don't need to read stories, you have lived them. The tales are an escape for those who have never known adventure," she responded, and he shook his head slightly, chuckling again. "You have an answer for everything," he said almost incredulously, but she could tell by the warmth of his voice that it was meant as a compliment. "You are rather wise yourself, even my grandfather will admit that," Ursula told him, "though, I confess, never in the company of my mother." Rob snorted at that, a small burst of laughter leaving him. She smiled herself, pleased that her words had not been taken badly. They had been said without thought, as her words with him often were now. At first she had been tentative and thought the words through in her head first. Then as she grew more and more comfortable around him the words just came more and more frequently without her thinking first. "I confess, I cannot help but have a grudging respect for your grandfather. It would be impossible not to, what with all the planning and the fighting we did together," Rob said. "That is almost exactly the same thing he says about you," Ursula giggled slightly, Rob joining in with her laughter for a moment. They lapsed into silence for a while after that, Ursula watching Grey Wind as he continued to bound ahead of them. She could not be sure, as she did not turn her head to see, but she had a suspicion that Rob was watching her as she was watching his wolf. The thought made her stomach twist in knots, but not the same nervous knots that had tightened within her on the arrival here. These knots were altogether more pleasant. In the end she could take no more, casting her eyes about the place for inspiration. The snow didn't settle, she finally said, seeing a hint of frost clinging to the vegetation, but no sign of any of the flakes that had fallen the night before. Believe it or not, it is still a little too warm, Rob replied. I imagine it will not be long, she mused, her eyes catching a bed of wilted flowers. They looked rather sorry for themselves, perhaps winter would be a mercy for them. No doubt, Rob agreed, but we can at least hope that it will stay dry for us tomorrow. Ursula hummed her agreement, unconsciously leaning her head closer to him so it brushed against his upper arm. They had almost done a full turn of the garden now, and Ursula wished that they had walked a little slower. These walks were the most enjoyable part of the day, the time when she and Rob could talk openly and honestly with one another without the threat of anyone overhearing them. It was rare they encountered anyone else out here, and Ursula was glad of it. I don't suppose we could walk around again, she asked Rob hopefully, inwardly praying that he would say yes. He chuckled lightly and she bit down on her bottom lip, waiting for his answer. I don't see why not, he said in an amused tone. They walked the rest of the path to the gate, Rob suggesting they take a different path for their next turn. Before they had reached a decision, however, the creak of the gate drew both of their attentions. Forgive me, Your Grace, Princess Sir Roderick bowed his head to each of them in turn. You have news for me? Rob inquired of the Master-at-Arms. Word from Torrens Square, Your Grace, the older man told him, a rather grim expression on his face. I assume it is not word that I will like, Rob said heavily, and Sir Roderick inclined his head in agreement. Master Hellman calls for aid, the food stores are being looted on an almost nightly basis. Even with the extra guard it is no good. 2 of the guard were badly beaten on one occasion and are still recovering with the Maester, Sir Roderick explained to him, and Rob sighed heavily at her side, his hand coming to run through his hair. I suppose Master Hellman realizes that I am getting married tomorrow, Rob said irritably, and again Sir Roderick inclined his head. He sends his sincerest apologies, Your Grace. But at this point he does not think anything but your own intervention will quell this matter. If it goes unchecked then word could filter to other settlements, and then you really will have a problem, Sir Roderick told him, and Ursula glanced at Rob to see him nodding his head in defeat. I'll take 200, Rob said heavily, make sure they are ready to leave the morning after the wedding. Ursula couldn't help but clench her hand tightly around his arm at that, and she knew that her dismay must have shown on her face as Sir Roderick sent her a sympathetic smile. I am sorry, Your Grace, Princess. He bowed his head, and Ursula tried to smile for him. It was not your doing, Rob said, his smile looking a little forced to Ursula. If it cheers you, Your Grace, there was also a letter from Pike, Sir Roderick continued, putting a hand into his cloak and drawing out a letter. Rob took it when he was offered, sliding it beneath his own cloak. Doubtless more of Theon's usual vulgarity, he said, the smile on his face looking more genuine this time. No doubt, Your Grace, Sir Roderick chuckled, before he bowed his head to them both once again. I will take my leave now, Your Grace, Princess. With that he turned and made his way back out of the gate, doubtless on his way to begin preparing the 200 men that Rob would be taking with him to Torrens Square. If this were the southern kingdoms then she knew well enough that a royal envoy would be sent, Tommen himself would stay at the capital. This wasn't the southern kingdoms though, and Rob was not Tommen. He did things his way, and his way involved getting his hands dirty. I am so sorry, Ursula. His genuine apology was almost enough to have tears springing to her eyes. I would expect no less, knowing the kind of king you are. Of course, I wish you didn't have to go, but I respect and understand why you are doing so, Ursula told him, meeting his eyes so he knew that she meant it. I know Winterfell will be in safe hands in my absence. He smiled down on her and her eyes widened. Me? She asked incredulously, his smile widening in response. Who else? You will be queen. There will be plenty of people here to help you, don't trouble yourself, he soothed her, his hands coming to rest on her upper arms and rub gently up and down them. How long will you be gone? She asked, unable to keep the trace of fear from her voice. A week, perhaps. Not long at all, not really, he promised, and she nodded her head in agreement. Good, she smiled, feeling him squeeze her upper arms lightly in response. Shall we continue our walk? Rob suggested. There is no reason for us to let this news spoil our day. Ursula was sat idly pulling the brush through her hair when the light tap came on her door. She set the brush down and turned on her stool, calling for her late-night visitor to come it. It was Lady Stark, and Myrcella was on her feet at once. "Relax," Lady Stark advised her at once. "That is more easily said than done, my lady," Myrcella told her honestly, and the older woman smiled in response. "Sit at least," she advised her, and Myrcella did as she was told, resuming her place on the stool. Lady Stark in turn crossed to perch herself on the edge of the bed facing her, the action making her swallow hard. "I took a guess that you would still be awake," Lady Stark said, and Myrcella smiled weakly in response. "Very astute of you, my lady," she said. "Are you worrying about tomorrow?" her future good mother asked her, and she sighed slightly. "A little," she confessed, "but it is thinking of the king riding out the morning after our wedding that is playing the most on my mind. I know that it isn't far, and that he is only dealing with a small group of thieves, but I don't like it." Lady Stark smiled at her sympathetically, slowly reaching one of her hands to take one of Myrcella's. "I hate it when he rides out. I always have, from the first time he was old enough to go with Ned to one of the holdfasts. But he must, and he will, because that is the man his father taught him to be, and the king he has chosen to be," Lady Stark explained to her, a sad little smile on her face. "And I will wait for him patiently, and pray for his return." "As you have no doubt done yourself for many years," Myrcella smiled in response. "It will be nice to have company in the September for once," Lady Stark said, a real sparkle in her eyes that made Myrcella feel warm and content inside. "I will be glad to join you," Myrcella told her honestly. "Is there anything else that is bothering you? Tomorrow night, perhaps?" Lady Stark asked her quietly, in an almost apologetic manner. "I know well enough what will happen tomorrow night," Myrcella said, averting her eyes for the first time. "It won't be perfect, or painless, but it gets better," Lady Stark told her, and Myrcella could almost feel the embarrassment rolling between them. "My mother told me all about it." Myrcella almost cringed, her hands coming to fist in the silk of her robe. "I'm sure," Lady Stark said dryly, and Myrcella couldn't help but smile slightly. "You know," Lady Stark seemed to hesitate, and Myrcella somehow forced herself to look up and meet her eyes again. "You know, it does not have to be a chore, nor a burden," the older woman told her awkwardly. "It can be special and loving, and pleasurable for both husband and wife." Myrcella swallowed hard at that, her cheeks burning. She could even see that a faint blush had risen up on the cheeks of Lady Stark, and for some inexplicable reason it made her want to laugh. She resisted. "Just about. I think there is more between Rob and I already than there ever was between my mother and my father," Myrcella said honestly, "and for that reason alone, I know that tomorrow night will not be quite the same ordeal she prepared me for." Good Lady Stark looked relieved, and Myrcella inwardly prayed that this could be the end of the awkwardness. "I will leave you to try and get some sleep," Lady Stark smiled at her, rising up from her perch on the edge of the bed. "Thank you," Myrcella responded, rising up from her own place. "Sansa and I will come in the morning to help you get ready," she told her, and Myrcella nodded in response. Lady Stark merely smiled warmly once more before she made her way to the door. She was halfway through it when Myrcella found her voice again. Lady Stark, her future good mother, paused and looked back at her. "Really, thank you." Chapter 11, Interlude, The Queen's Scheme. Notes. Just a very brief chapter, showing a little snippet from the capital. Hope you all enjoy it. The wedding is up next, and I'll post that at the weekend. Thanks to everyone who left kudos, much appreciated. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Cersei. She swilled the glass of wine in her hand, staring out over the blackness of the water. There were pricks of light here and there, dotted about in the waves. Ships. Merchants. Smugglers. People Cersei did not give a damn about. There were precious few people she did give a damn about, and her father seemed intent on stealing them away from her. Was it not bad enough that she had had to suffer the death of her oldest boy? Her perfect, golden lion. Joffrey had been a perfect king. Yes, he had had a temper. And yes, often he acted without thinking. But a king needed fire, and a passion in his belly. He had not deserved his fate. Never in a million years had he deserved to die under the feet of those ingrates that he had ruled over. That had been bad enough, but then her father had taken away her hopes for revenge. You see, it was that Stark girl's fault, what had become of Joffrey. All her fault, for sitting there on that horse at his side with a moping face and sad eyes. What did she have to be sad about? She was set to become queen. Give Joffrey sons. The stupid girl. She was as ungrateful as the unwashed peasants who had dragged him to his death. How Cersei wished that they had dragged Sansa Stark instead. At least then her boy would have had the opportunity to take better queen. Someone who was worthy of him. She brought her wine to her lips with shaking hands and took a great gulp of it. Some dribbled down her chin and she wiped it impatiently away with the sleeve of her dress. Gods, how she had wanted Sansa Stark to pay the price for Joffrey. Her father hadn't allowed it. He had placed the girl under the protection of the imp of all people while he had ridden off to treat with Robb Stark. Robb Stark hadn't deserved to be treated with, he had deserved his head atop his spike, just like his worthless father. Instead, her own father had offered him her daughter. Never had she felt rage like it than when he had told her that. She had been given no opportunity to refuse. It was done. Just like that. Myrcella will be his queen, Cersei. It is the only way that we can hope to maintain anything resembling a civil relationship with the North. Cersei did not want a civil relationship with the North. She wanted the North stamped out. She wanted the Starks destroyed and a family of puppets installed at Winterfell. All her wants fell on deaf ears, and her stupid daughter had never uttered one word of protest. That in itself helped ensure that her father insisted on the match going ahead. Her younger children had never had the same fire in them as Joffrey. They were meek and quiet. Gentle and quick to cry. Weak. She sucked down more of her wine, tapping her fingers against the glass. She loved them despite their inadequacies, of course she did. She was their mother. There was hope for Tommen, he could be molded into a strong king, she was certain of it. For Myrcella, there was little hope for her unless Cersei could get her back from the North. It would not be easy, but she was determined to do it. She had to do it. She refused to lose her daughter to that bleak wasteland. It was bad enough that Robb Stark would steal her innocence and claim her as his queen. She closed her eyes in despair, remembering her own nights of suffering in Robert's bed. She had little hope that her daughter's fate would be any better. At least Cersei had had Jaime. Myrcella had no one. And worse still, she was weak, where Cersei had always been strong. It had been easy to close her heart to Robert, easy to despise him and bide her time. Myrcella was not that calculating, that had always been her problem, and that was why Cersei knew she would have to extract her from the North herself. She would have to bide her time again, though hopefully not for as long. She was determined not to make her daughter suffer Robb Stark for as long as she had suffered Robert Baratheon. As soon as Myrcella had a son she would put her plan into action. Jaime would have to aid her, he was the only one she could trust not to tell father. They would have to find a way to explain his long absence, but Cersei was sure that they could devise something together. Jaime would be just as desperate as she was to get Myrcella back, she was certain of it. He would do anything, and she had no doubt that he would relish in the chance to revenge himself upon the boy who had kept him captive for all that time. Yes, Jaime would aid her, and as soon as Myrcella birthed a son Robb Stark's days as king in the North would be numbered. With his death the North would be weak, their king an infant. A babe at the breast. Myrcella would be regent, as his mother. She would have all the power, and all she would have to do was reunite the North and the Riverlands with the southern kingdoms. Then she could come home. Cersei drained her wine and smiled wryly. They would have to live with the fact that she had a half-Stark son, but what other choice did she have? She had to get her daughter back, and Myrcella would no doubt be aching to come home. Cersei would get her home, she promised the night sky. I will get her home, she murmured fiercely, by whatever means I will get her home. Chapter 12, X, White Wedding. Notes. It's the wedding chapter everyone. Just to confirm, there will be adult content in this chapter, so if you're uncomfortable with it then you may want to skip the last bit. I'm not sure about bumping this up to an explicit rating. For now I've left it as mature, but after reading if you think I should bump it up higher then please let me know, I don't want to offend anyone. Thanks to everyone who left comments on the last chapter, it's much appreciated, though Cersei won't be implementing her little scheme for a while yet. Special thanks to Sky Samuel for your comments, what you said about R and M's relationship being pure and almost innocent is really appreciated, because that is exactly what I was going for. Also, spot on about Circea too, she always strikes me as being incredibly delusional, and that's not to mention how inconsiderate she is. Righty-ho everybody, I hope you all enjoy the wedding. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Rob. It had snowed in the night, a proper fall which had coated Winterfell in an inch of the cold, wet flakes. Rob wagered that it would turn to muddy slush by the end of the day, and he had instructed a group of men to clear a path through the courtyard to the Godswood as soon as he had risen that morning. He was walking along that cleared path now, pleased to see that they had done a good job. It was not himself he was concerned with, it was Myrcella. He knew how happy she was with her wedding dress, and he imagined she would be upset if the bottom of it was soaked through and stained with mud by the time she reached the Godswood. Though he thought it likely that she would inevitably damage the bottom of it, he was hopeful that it would not be as bad now that she had a clear walkway. It would not be long. Soon she would be making her own way to the Godswood. The thought of it had his hands coming to rearrange his doublet nervously. He declined the urge to look back at the Smalljan, who was walking behind him carrying the cloak bearing the white direwolf on a background of silver silk. Only a precious few of his lords had made the journey for the wedding. He had been expecting many to decline, and he was not offended, he only hoped that Myrcella would not be. It was easy to make excuses at such a time. It was too far to be gone from their own keeps what with winter well on its way. The Great Yon had not come, that was Rob's only regret. His son had though. The Smalljan was one of Rob's closest friends, and he had believed him implicitly when he had told him that his father was ill. None of the Mormonts were present, not that Rob was expecting them to come. Bear Island was a long distance in the best of weathers. He did not blame them at all for not making the journey. Lord Bolton was absent, not that Rob had been particularly hungry for his company. The Sowins had come, and several of the Flints. A few Mondaelis had made the journey, and most unexpectedly of all, Harry on Carstark. His father had not come, but he had sent his one surviving son in his place, with his apologies. Rob did not need his apologies, and he had implored Harry on to make sure his father knew how grateful he was to have a Carstark presence at his wedding. None of his lords had been overly impressed at the thought of a Lannister queen, but Rob knew that it was hardest of all for Lord Carstark to stomach. They would all have to meet her at the first gathering of the Lord's Council after winter though, and Rob was confident that Myrcella would be able to win them over. He had been unable to help liking her, and enjoying her company. She was not a Lannister to him in anything but looks, and that he was more than happy to live with. He did wish he did not have to up and leave her the morning after their wedding though. Once upon a time he imagined he would relish any chance he had to be away from her. Not now though. Now he looked forward to spending time with her and enjoying her company. Their strolls around the gardens had slowly become his favorite part of the day. He smiled wryly, knowing that when the snows fell thicker they would no longer be able to participate in that particular pastime. He tore his mind from that as he finally entered the Godswood, noting that all those attending were already present, besides Myrcella and Oliver of course. He strode towards the heart tree to take his place, seeing his family lined up nearby as he came to a halt. His heart panged dully for those he was missing. Jon ought to be here, but he could not leave the wall now that there was a chance he would be unable to get back. His brother had sent him a letter of tentative congratulations, urging him to at least try and enjoy his life with his new bride. Rob was intent on writing back to reassure him that his feelings were not the same as the last time he had written about her. The memory of that letter made him cringe slightly. He had been so bitter. Unfeeling. Cold. He refused to be like that anymore, he had no cause to be like that anymore. Not now that he knew Myrcella's true nature. Oddly he was missing Theon as well. He had not seen his friend since the war beyond the wall. On his return to Pike he had docked to discover that Rob had already parleyed with Tywin Lannister, and that ships from his father were no longer needed. He had written to Rob for leave to stay on the Iron Islands, and be with the family he had been raised apart from for most of his life. Rob had agreed, there was no reason not to anymore. Grudgingly he had asked Tywin for his permission on the matter, and the old lion had waved his consent dismissively before talk had swiftly turned back to the best way to rid themselves of Stannis and Renly. Theon was lord of the Iron Islands now, his father had taken ill during the last winter and never recovered. His mother still lived, but from what Theon had told him she had been sucked even further into the depths of madness. Theon didn't complain though, nor did he seem bitter, and Robb was pleased he was finding his feet as a lord and a leader, even if it meant him being absent from Winterfell. Robb scanned his family again, noting for the first time that his mother was not clad in black. It was the first time he had seen her in anything that resembled color in so many years, and he was touched that she had managed it for his wedding. For songs as he remembered her wearing a cloak of grey. That was the closest she had come before. This time she was wearing a blue dress, albeit a rather dark shade of blue, beneath the same grey cloak. He sent her a small smile and she returned it, inclining her head slightly. He knew she would miss his father today, just as he himself would. What he wouldn't give to see him walking into the Godswood, leading Myrcella towards him. He swallowed hard. It was not his father escorting Myrcella, it was Oliver, and Robb had just caught a glimpse of them through the trees lining the Godswood. Her dress was as white as the untouched snow around the pool of the Godswood. Even from a distance he could see that the bodice was sewn with pearls and silver and golden thread. Pearls were woven into her hair as well, which was half braided back from her face to allow her golden curls to tumble down her back. Around her shoulders was a black cloak made of fine velvet, and Robb imagined that the golden stag of House Baratheon would be woven into the back of it. He swallowed hard as she and Oliver came to a halt on the opposite side of the pool to him. Everyone in the Godswood seemed to have turned to stare at her, and he vaguely wondered if she looked as enchanting to them as she did to him. He had always known she was beautiful, it seemed only now he was appreciating just how captivating she really was. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was it. He could not allow the silence to continue much longer. "Who comes? Who comes before the gods?" Robb asked clearly, his eyes unable to move from Myrcella, even though he knew it would be Oliver who answered. "Myrcella, of House Baratheon comes here to be wed." A woman grown and flowered, true-born and noble. Oliver's voice didn't waver, despite the slight murmuring that seemed to accompany the word true-born. Robb was irked, but he pushed it aside as Oliver continued. "She comes to claim the blessings of the gods." "Who comes to claim her?" "Me," Robb said firmly, determined to show those whisperers that it mattered not to him. That he was glad to marry Myrcella, whatever her true status. "Robb, of House Stark," he continued clearly, "King in the North and of the Trident, and Lord of Winterfell. I claim her." "Who gives her?" he asked, finally moving his eyes from his bride and to his good brother. "Oliver, of House Free," Oliver replied, meeting Robb's eyes for a moment before he turned his attention to Myrcella. "Princess Myrcella, will you take this man?" "I take this man," Myrcella said, her voice strong and clear as her eyes found Robb's. He smiled a tiny smile for her, and she relinquished her hold on Oliver's arm at the gesture. Slowly she walked from him, stepping around the pool until she stood face to face with Robb. He offered his hand at once and she gave her own without hesitation. Robb put a little pressure on her hand as he took it in his, holding her eyes and sharing a smile with her before they both turned slightly to face the heart tree. They knelt as one, their hands still clasped, and bowed their heads in submission to the old gods. Robb knew that Myrcella did not pray to these gods, but he himself sent a silent prayer to them. A happy and contented life. That's all he asked for. That's all he had ever wanted. He squeezed her hand lightly again once he had finished, hoping that she would understand the pressure. She squeezed his back, and he assumed that she had. He raised his bowed head before rising slowly to his feet, keeping Myrcella's hand firmly in his own to keep her steady as she rose gracefully back up. With that Robb glanced behind him, nodding slightly to the Smalljan, who approached slowly with the Stark cloak draped over his arm. Robb turned his attention back to his bride, moving his fingers to the clasp around her neck. He could feel her warm breath on the back of his hand as he unfastened her maiden's cloak from around her and slipped it away from her shoulders. He passed it back to the Smalljan, receiving the Stark cloak in return and sweeping it quickly around Myrcella's shoulders before she had the chance to get cold. His fingers shook ever so slightly as he fastened the clasp, knowing that this final gesture was the one that bound them fully as husband and wife. When he moved his hands away again he met her eyes before taking both her hands in both of his, tugging her closer slightly. She moved willingly, her head already tilted up so she could meet his eyes. In that moment he wished that he had kissed her that night when they had stood out in the snow, when there had not been any other eyes on them. Now they were surrounded by people, and he could practically see Merciless nerves shining in her eyes. He couldn't not kiss her. For one thing he wanted to, and for another, it would look bad to those in attendance. They would make assumptions. Wrong assumptions, that he wished to avoid at all costs. He pushed that from his mind and leaned into Merciless, tilting his head and closing his eyes the moment before their lips met. Hers were soft and warm as he had expected them to be, and he let his own linger for a long moment before he pulled back. She smiled widely when he did so, and he returned the gesture gladly, unable to believe that this moment he had dreaded for so many years had brought him such an inexplicable joy. "It's gorgeous, really, but I could not have another bite," Merciless protested, raising her hands up to stop Rob from tempting her with another forkful of raspberry and cream tart. "Are you certain I cannot persuade you?" he asked her teasingly, and she shook her head determinedly. "No, you cannot, not in this matter at any rate," she answered him, and he chuckled, laying the fork back down against his plate before contemplating his new wife. She had discarded her cloak due to the heat in the dining hall, and the unblemished skin of her arms was teasing him through the delicate lace of her sleeves. He was so busy admiring her that he didn't notice that she was no longer occupied with sipping from her wine glass. She cleared her throat slightly, and he snapped his eyes up to meet her amused gaze. Admiring the lace, she arched that one brow, and he smiled sheepishly. "Something like that," he muttered, holding her eyes for a moment before he turned to pick up his own glass. "It's been dark for rather a while," Merciless mused quietly as he sipped down the sweet wine. "Indeed," he agreed with her after he swallowed his mouthful. "I wonder when," she hesitated, "when the call will come for us to leave," she finished, and Rob moved his hand to lay across hers. "The bedding will not be called for," he soothed her, rubbing his thumb against the back of her hand. "What do you mean?" She turned to frown at him, and he could have sworn a glimmer of disappointment shone in them. Had she thought he had meant there would be no bedding, and been disappointed? The thought made his stomach twist in knots, and had him thinking that they really ought to retire soon. "I mean I will not have you humiliated, the men pouring at you. I won't allow it, you're my queen," he explained. "We will retire when we are both ready. From that I can only assume that you are waiting on me." She smiled rather wickedly at him, and he narrowed his eyes at her. "And will you keep me waiting?" he asked her softly, leaning in slightly closer to her. No, the simple word sounded like magic, and Rob's eyes could see the quickening of her breathing in the way her bodice rose and fell more rapidly. "Then will you allow me to escort you to my chambers?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes," she breathed back, that one word making his breeches feel uncomfortably tight. Gods, he had been far too long without a woman. Looking at Merciless, however, had him certain that his patience would be well rewarded. Slowly he pushed back his chair and rose up to his feet, offering her his hand. She took it, rising up to her own feet. At their action the dining hall seemed to pause, and Rob swallowed hard, knowing he would have to address them. "The Queen and I are retiring for the night," Rob declared, feeling Merciless add pressure to his hand at his words. "Please, in our absence continue to feast, drink and dance until whatever hour you choose." A cheer went up at his words, and there was the distinct clanking of many tankards and glasses. Rob pulled Merciless away from the high table and off the dais, skirting the edge of the dining hall rather than leading her through the middle of the throng of people. Her hand was holding on tightly to his, but he did not complain of the pressure, knowing that she was likely nervous. He himself was nervous, having never taken a maid into his bed before. The last thing he wanted to do was hurt her, but he knew well enough that he would not be able to prevent all of her discomfort. He could make it as bearable as possible, that was about as much as he could promise. After the first time he could promise her pleasure, his time with Ada had taught him the best ways to satisfy a woman. He almost shuddered with desire, thinking of manipulating Merciless's glorious body in any number of ways. How he longed to have her shaking beneath him, clenching tightly around him and crying out her relief to the gods. Damn it all, his breeches really were unbearably tight now, and they were not even halfway up the stairs. He quickened the pace slightly, hoping that Merciless would not be offended by his eagerness. With every step he reminded himself that he could not just remove her gown and ravish her as soon as they closed the door to his chambers. He had to be slow with her. Gentle. He had to be patient and reassure her that he was happy to go at her pace. This time, at least. Gods. He almost groaned as he remembered he would have to leave her in the morning. It would be a good week at least before he could really show his wife what sharing his bed could be like. Rob could have wept in relief when they came upon his chamber door, and he pushed it open, pulling Ursula in after him before he closed it firmly behind them and slid the lock into place. He turned to look at her then, seeing her eyes lingering on the locked door. "I would leave it open, but we have rather a lot in the keep tonight, and a large portion of them will likely end up drunk and disorientated." He smiled reassuringly at her and she giggled slightly. His eyes were drawn to her hands, seeing how her fingers flexed towards her palms. He frowned, crossing to her and gently taking hold of her hands. "I hate it when you do that," he murmured, looking up to meet her eyes and seeing that a frown adorned her own face. "I hate to think that anything here makes you feel like he did." "That I make you feel like he did? You don't." Ursula protested at once, her hands flying to his chest as her head shook almost violently. "You couldn't, you never did, not once have I been frightened of you." "Apprehensive, yes. Nervous, yes. But not frightened." "You don't frighten me, Rob. You could never make me feel the way he did, not ever. It is not your nature, and I thank the gods for it every day." He let one of his own hands come up and caress one of hers in response, hoping to calm the wild look in her eyes. "I wasn't accusing you," he said softly, "but after what you told me, I can't help but notice it. I know you're nervous about tonight, but I swear the last thing in this world I want to do is hurt you." "I know," she whispered, her free hand coming to toy with the leather lacings of his doublet. He didn't move. He kept silent, just watching the progress of her finger as she wound the lacing round and around it. When she tugged on it slightly, as though for permission, he met her eyes and inclined his head slightly. At his action she pulled more firmly, undoing the top of his doublet. He heard her take a steadying breath, and he stepped closer on hearing it, moving his hand from hers so he could place both of his on her waist. "As slow as you like," he promised, not moving his eyes from hers. "Say stop, and I will, without question." She nodded at his words, both hands at his chest working to unthread his doublet. Rob kept his hands resting gently on her waist as she slowly loosened it until she came to the bottom and left his doublet hanging open. Her hands clenched around the open lapels of his doublet and he leaned in closer to her and brushed his lips against her cheek. She tilted her head at his action, turning it closer towards him. Her action was enough to encourage him to capture her lips with his. This time it was far from chaste, as he sucked her bottom lip between his own to encourage her to grant him access to her mouth. She did so, with a surprised gasp, and Rob wasted little time, slipping his tongue into her mouth and kissing her deeply. Her own lips were tentative, but they were ever so soft and wonderful against his as she slowly adjusted to the rhythm he had set. He caressed her tongue with his own and she twisted hers deftly with his, causing him to pull on her waist until her body was pressed flush against him. She didn't protest at his closeness, if anything she reciprocated his advances, her hands moving from his lapel so she could wrap her arms tightly around his neck. Her movement encouraged him to let his hands wander up her back, feeling the lacings of her dress as he did so. When he found the top of them he blindly worked his fingers to untie them, feeling them come away beneath his touch. Ursula twisted the fingers on one of her hands around the hair at the nape of his neck as he began to slowly unthread the lacings of her dress the way she had loosened his doublet. She pulled away from his kiss when he reached halfway down her back, her breathing ragged and her eyes wide. "Should I stop?" he asked her, and she shook her head. "I just needed to breathe," she panted out, and he chuckled at her. "You'll get used to it," he said, still deftly unthreading her laces. "I do hope so." She smiled that wicked little smile that he had seen during the feast, and he couldn't help but return it. "I can't promise you a perfect night, Ursula," he said seriously when he pulled the last of her lacings free. "This is already more than I ever imagined," she said just as seriously, and he smiled slightly. "When I return from Torrens Square, I swear to you, I will make up for it," he promised her, and she blinked slowly at him. "I don't know what that means," she said, her eyes wide on his. "It doesn't matter now," he said, shaking his head and moving his hands to run down the length of her arms. When he reached her shoulders she allowed her arms to unwind from around his neck, moving them back to her sides. "Can I?" he asked her permission, digging his fingers underneath the silk covering her shoulders. She nodded her consent, and he dipped his eyes to look down at her hands as he began to pull down her dress. Her fingers twitched slightly, but they did not curl back against her palms as he peeled the silk down her arms and torso. She was wearing a flimsy shift beneath, and he was gratified to see that the buds of her breasts were peaked. He knew it could not be due to the cold, as his chamber was almost as warm as the dining hall had been, and there was no sign of goose flesh on her skin. He delighted in revealing her skin. The soft, creamy expanse of it was entirely flawless. Nothing marred it. Not one scar nor blemish. Not so far anyway. Rob made it his silent mission to explore every inch of her skin. Perhaps not tonight, but one night in the not-too-distant future. He would scour every inch. He promised himself that. He wanted to promise her, too, but he wasn't sure whether she would want to hear it at this point, as her beautiful wedding gown dropped and cooled at her feet. Rob moved his hands back to her shoulders, massaging her gently as he met her eyes. "You can take this off yourself, when you're ready," he nodded towards her shift. "Thank you," she smiled at him, a proper smile that lit up her eyes. "That doesn't mean it has to be tonight," he elaborated, and she nodded, though he noticed that her eyes had widened slightly in surprise. "Perhaps if you lose a little of your own clothing," her tone was teasing, but he could hear the tiny shake in her voice. "As you wish, my queen," he decided against drawing attention to it, matching her intended teasing tone. He shrugged his doublet carefully from his shoulders before loosening the ties on his tunic. Suddenly he felt incredibly self-conscious with her eyes fixed so intently on him. His scarred body had never bothered any of the other women he had taken to his bed, but none of them had been Mercila. Most of them had scars or blemishes of their own. Not Mercila. Not his milk-skinned wife. He bit down on his lower lip before he pulled the tunic up and over his head, tossing it aside before looking to her for a reaction. Her eyes had widened slightly and his heart hammered, seeing how the perfect green of them was pulled towards his left shoulder. That was the worst of his scars, where the 3 talons had scraped through the weakness in his armor and raked through his skin. They hadn't been deep, but they had been bloody, and he had always known they would be with him forever. At least they were no longer angry, and pink, and raw. They were fully healed now, a flawless white against his skin. He swallowed, keeping his eyes on Mercila as she moved her eyes over the rest of his chest and arms. She took a step closer to him, her fingers coming to whisper along his forearm and up to his bicep. Her forefinger traced a tiny scar just above the crease in his elbow, her eyes raising to his again. "How did you do this one?" she asked, and he wanted to kiss her and never stop. The relief in him was so overwhelming that he was almost crushed by the weight of it. "As a child, sparring with wooden swords," he told her, "we were only in tunics, and John caught me on the arm. There was a nasty splinter in the wood and it embedded itself in my skin. The maester pulled it out with tweezers and I screamed the whole time, more to make John feel guilty than anything else." He grinned at the end, and she smiled back at him, her eyes blazing with an intensity that he had never seen before as she looked at him. Slowly she moved her hands up to rest on her own shoulders, and Rob swallowed hard as she hooked her fingers under the thin straps of her shift. He kept his eyes on hers as she slipped them slowly along her shoulders, unable to look away from her piercing gaze. "Take me to bed," she whispered, the wisp of silk that was her shift falling to the floor at her feet. Rob didn't need telling twice, placing his hands on her now bare waist and steering her slowly towards the bed. He turned her gently so that she was stood before him as he lowered himself to sit on the edge of the bed. She bit down on her lip as he allowed his eyes to wander the splendor of her. Still he could see no flaw. No blemish. Nothing to suggest she was anything other than sheer perfection. Her breasts were firm and perfectly rounded, and he couldn't help but imagine how they would fit perfectly in his hands. Her waist was narrow and her stomach flat. His eyes wandered the curve of her hips, biting down on his own lip as he sought out what was between her creamy thighs. Gods! He wanted her. He looked up to her face again, seeing her eyes wide once more. "Your perfection," he breathed, and he could see the relief relaxing all of her features. In the next moment he bent down to hurriedly unlace and pull off his boots, before he straightened up again, pulling back the furs on the bed as he slowly stood up. "After you," he gestured for Mercila to climb in, and she did so, clearly unsure of how she should arrange the furs around her. "Whatever makes you comfortable," he reminded her, and she drew them up around her waist at his words. Rob averted his eyes momentarily as he moved to unlace his breeches, finally freeing his painfully hard length from its confines. He breathed a sigh of relief before he turned to climb in next to Ursula, avoiding her gaze for the moment, only looking at her again when he too had drawn the furs up around his waist. "I don't know what to do next," she told him quietly, her hand reaching out to settle on his chest. "Will you guide me?" she asked shyly. "Of course," he replied, shifting himself carefully so that he could move above her. A flash of uncertainty crossed her features for a moment, but then he noticed her slowly moving her legs apart for him. "Follow your instincts," he breathed, settling himself between her legs before pressing a kiss to her neck. "If I do something you don't like, tell me to stop," he whispered, lavishing more kisses along her neck and collarbone. "And if you do like it, tell me to do it again," he continued in an amused tone, feeling her hands come to lay flat against the top of his back. "I like that," she said quietly. "What you're doing now?" He smiled against her skin, imagining the light blush that would have flared up on her cheeks. "Then I will continue," he murmured against her softness, nuzzling along her collarbone before he latched onto her neck. She gasped, her back arching up slightly against his body, her reaction encouraging him to let his hand wander slowly up towards her breast. Another gasp left her when he enclosed his hand around the perfect mound. He had been right, it did fit perfectly in his hand, and a tiny little hum left her mouth as he began to tenderly massage her. As he continued kissing her and caressing her, she began to slowly raise her hips up and grind against him as slowly as he was touching her breast. He stifled his own groan of pleasure in the skin of her neck, as a more pronounced hum of pleasure escaped her lips. The rolling of her hips was almost driving him wild now, and he shifted himself slightly so that his length could sit between her legs. "Don't stop," he gasped against her neck as her movements faltered. She obeyed him, continuing to grind herself against him in an agonizingly slow way. Rob could feel her arousal against his hardness, and he knew that he could not ignore his own desires any longer. "Ursula," he panted against her, tensing all his muscles in a bid to keep himself from peaking right there and then. "Have me," she gasped in response. "I want you to have me, completely." Gods, her words alone were the most arousing thing he could imagine. Her consent had him sneaking his other hand beneath the furs to squeeze around her thigh and encourage her leg to come and wrap around his waist. She took his hint, lifting her other leg to do the same. Rob was positioned right at her entrance now, and he lifted his head up to meet her eyes. They were slightly unfocused, her forehead clammy with sweat and her hair mussed across the pillows. By the gods, she looked stunning. So undone and beautiful. Perfect in her imperfection. He held her eyes as he pushed down, her nails pinching little crescents into his back as he felt himself push through the barrier he was met with. A whimper escaped her, her teeth coming to clamp down on her lower lip once more. "I'm sorry," he hissed, forcing himself to still within her, even though the urge to rock himself over and over within her tight warmth was almost overwhelming. "Don't stop," she shook her head, her nails ceasing to dig into his back. He obeyed. Against his better judgment he obeyed her, rocking his hips back and forth. She grimaced and he faltered, but again she shook her head. There were tears in her eyes, but still she refused to let him stop, and fool he was, he could do nothing but continue thrusting into her. He knew she was hurting, but she felt so good around him and she was telling him to go on. In the end he had to bury his head in the crook of her neck so he didn't have to see the discomfort etched on her face. It was selfish, he knew, but he couldn't stand knowing that he was causing her pain. He kissed her neck, knowing from her own admission that she liked him to do so. Her fingertips whispered down his back in response, and he arched further into her involuntarily. His movement caused him to rock deeper inside her, and a cry that seemed half pain and half surprise escaped her. He closed his eyes tight shut as he thrust again, forcing himself to keep the pace slow as he felt his release building in him. He would not make Ursula come this time, but he was determined he would show her every pleasure he knew how to elicit when he returned from Torrens Square. He promised himself that as he exploded within her, panting hard and crushing his exhausted body down against her own as he twitched to his end inside her. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, when he had recovered enough breath to speak again. "Don't be." Her hands came to settle in his hair, gently twirling his curls around her fingertips. "Would you let me stay here?" she asked him quietly. "You don't even have to ask, of course I want you to stay here." He lifted his head up to meet her eyes. "I want you to stay here even when I am not here. I want these chambers to be ours, Ursula," he told her insistently, and she smiled weakly at him. Hold me, she whispered, and he shifted himself carefully to separate himself from her once more. He moved to her side and helped her settle herself across his chest, nestling her head under his chin and stroking one of his hands soothingly through her hair. "Will you promise to wake me before you leave tomorrow?" she asked him sleepily, her nails clenching into his chest slightly as she spoke. "If that's what you want," he said, and she nodded against him. "Then I will gladly promise you." Chapter 13:11, A Cold Bed. Notes. Thanks so much for the kudos and the comments on the last chapter, much appreciated as always. To answer the lovely guest who left a comment, Rob wasn't irked that his bannermen know that Myrcella is a bastard, he was irked because people were muttering about it during their wedding. The treaty doesn't mean that both sides have to like one another, but I think he would have liked a little more respect shown to the woman who was about to become his wife and queen. So, he was irked at their rudeness, not at their knowledge. Hope that explains it. I'm glad you're enjoying the story, and yes, Rob and Arya will have a proper talk when he comes back from his excursion. Righty-ho, it's the morning after, let's get on with it. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. It was strange, waking up unclothed with her skin pressed so tightly against someone else's. Her legs were tangled with Rob's as she blinked herself fully awake, and she stayed still in his loose embrace for a long moment, trying to memorize everything about this moment. How she felt. How he felt against her. The hair of his legs was coarse and rough against the smoothness of her own, but the contrast felt good. It felt so very good. She lifted her eyes up to study his still sleeping face. He was a handsome man. That had never been in doubt. His features could almost be described as beautiful if it weren't for the sharp angles of his jaw. She bit down on her lip, wondering if it would wake him if she ran her hand across his cheek. His beard was softer than she had imagined it to be. That had been surprising to learn when he had kissed her for the first time. She had imagined it would be rough, that it would scratch and irritate her skin. Myrcella was glad that it didn't, because she rather enjoyed kissing Rob. His lips on hers made her stomach knot deliciously, and made her want to be as close to him as physically possible. She had been the night before. They had been joined as one. For a little while they had almost been one person. Separate entities, but joined entirely. It had hurt at first, feeling him inside her. It had almost felt like an intrusion. She supposed it was in a way, but it was one that her body slowly grew used to. There was still a dull ache between her thighs, but somehow she knew that it was nothing a hot bath would not soothe. Besides, she had a week or more before Rob could be with her so intimately again, and she imagined that would be more than enough time for the pain to fade. It would not hurt again. That is what she had always been told. That it only hurt the first time. She bit down on her lip as she continued watching Rob sleep, wondering exactly what he had meant when he told her he would make it up to her on his return. She could not deny that his kisses had left her breathless, and that his touch had made her want to shudder in delight. When she had moved herself against him and felt warmth spreading between her thighs, she had felt her stomach clenching hard in anticipation of something that had never quite come. Perhaps that is what he meant. The thought of what that might feel like almost made her want to rouse him from sleep and persuade him to bed her again before he left. Somehow she imagined that he wouldn't. He had been determined not to hurt her any more than necessary, and Myrcella could not deny that being with him again would probably make the pain between her legs even worse. She huffed, wondering if she could shift herself from his arms and stretch her body out without waking him. Slowly she shifted slightly, and was about to roll away from him when his arms tightened around her waist, a shuddering sigh leaving him. "And where do you think you're going?" he asked her groggily, and she glanced at his face to see that he had opened one eye. The beautiful blue of it was watching her suspiciously. "I wasn't going anywhere," she told him quietly, "I just wanted to stretch myself a little, that's all. I didn't mean to wake you." He huffed and groaned in response, releasing her from his embrace so she could roll over onto her back. She arched her back and stretched her limbs before turning her head to see him rubbing at his eyes. "It's a good thing you woke me, I will have to leave soon," he said tiredly, stretching his arms above his head before he rolled over onto his side and looked down on her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his hand coming to stroke lightly down her cheek. Even that simple touch made her tingle in any number of places, but she imagined that may have more to do with the fact that they were both naked. "I'm well enough," Slightly sore but nothing to be concerned with, she told him honestly. I think I will call for a bath once you have gone. He frowned slightly at her, moving his hand to brush a stray lock of her hair away from her face. That is very cruel, he said, leaving me with the image of you bathing alone while I am riding through the cold north. She smiled widely at that, lifting her own hand to stroke down his cheek as she had been tempted to do while he was still sleeping. I'll be here waiting for you when you get back, she reminded him, and he hummed in agreement, turning his head so he could press a kiss to her palm. Right here in this bed, he asked, before kissing at her again. Or in the bath? Whatever is agreeable to you, Your Grace, she said teasingly, unable to stop a giggle escaping her as he smothered her palm with kisses. I think either would be perfectly agreeable, he answered her, and she rubbed her thumb firmly up and down against his cheek. It will be a long week, she said quietly, and he smiled regretfully. I know, he agreed heavily, but unfortunately it must be done. I cannot just allow what is happening at Torrens Square to continue. Ursula hummed her agreement. I know, she sighed, and likely I am just being foolish. A week is not so long. I am sure I will just about survive without your company. I am sure you will find plenty to occupy yourself with, he said. You can start by moving your things into my chambers. And you can have some of the men move the vanity and the dresser if you need them. Ursula could not hide her delighted smile at that. She had been thrilled with Rob's words from the night before, but unsure if he would feel the same about sharing his space with her come morning. Most lords and ladies she had ever come across had separate bedchambers, even the ones who were fond of one another. Men took mistresses, that was well known. A man could love his wife, but would never truly be satisfied by her and her alone. Ursula had expected Rob to be the same, but if he intended on bedding mistresses, then why would he insist she share his chambers? Are you sure you want to share this space with me? She asked him. Why would I not want you here? You're my wife. He frowned at her, and she smiled slightly. It's just not the done thing where I am from, that's all, she soothed him, but the frown was still creasing his brow. Ursula, you know, even if things between us were not this contented, I would never be unfaithful to you. My father taught me the value of honor, and that included honoring the woman I took as my wife. He broke his vows, and though I know he loved John as he loved the rest of us, I also know he never forgave himself for betraying my mother. I do not intend to repeat his mistakes, especially now I have come to care so much about you, he told her quietly but firmly, and she swallowed hard to try and quell the tears that had begun to sting her eyes. I care about you very much too, she confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. She could almost hear her mother's voice in her head, but she ignored it. Her mother was wrong. There could be nothing better than affection growing between her and Rob. It was how a marriage ought to be. Not poisonous and bitter like her mother and father's had been. By the gods, I am going to give those looters hell for dragging me away from you, he practically growled, and Ursula laughed slightly. Why do you suppose they are stealing? She asked him curiously, hearing him sigh heavily in response. There are only two reasons for it in my mind, he told her, and she arched one brow, waiting for his answer. Through desperation, or greed. She nodded slightly at that, and Rob shifted himself up onto his elbow so he was propped above her. I hope you will not give them hell if they are desperate, she smiled up at him as he stroked his hand down her cheek. I would not, he confirmed, but something is telling me that this isn't being done out of desperation. Supplies fetch a fine price later in the winter when stores run low and bellies run empty. That is when the looters gain. They will take a family's earnings for an entire year if they can. That's awful, Ursula said honestly, and Rob leaned in closer to her and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Do not think on it, I will make sure it is fixed, and the looters weeded out, Rob said reassuringly as he pulled away from her again. What will you do with them? She asked him curiously. They will be placed on basic rations, and publicly shamed, he replied. Ursula nodded at that, thinking it was a fair enough way to treat those who sought to exploit their fellow townsfolk when desperation began to set in. I really ought to prize myself away from you, Rob said regretfully before leaning into her again and pressing his lips to hers. She kissed him back gladly, feeling more confident now in the way she moved her lips with his than she had done the night before. He deepened the kiss in the next moment, kissing her so forcefully that she could barely breathe, before he pulled back, his breathing slightly ragged. Without another word he rolled away from her, slipping out of the bed and walking towards his dresser. Mercilla's eyes followed his progress, unable to stop herself from admiring the muscles of his back as he stood facing away from her. Sinfully she allowed her eyes to wander lower, over the curve of his bottom and down the powerful muscles of his thighs and calves. When he extracted his clothes from the dresser and turned back towards her, she fixed her eyes determinedly on his face until he had pulled on his breeches. As his attention was caught up with lacing them, she allowed her eyes to wander his bare chest. She had admired it the night before, the strong muscles and the countless scars that marred him. In truth, she thought they made him even more attractive. Made him even more of a man, and she silently promised herself that she would learn the story behind each and every one of them. She could guess the one behind the 3 gashes that ran across his left shoulder and a little way down his chest. Only the dragon could have inflicted such a wound. She already knew the one behind the one on his right bicep, as he had told her the night before at her bidding. Vaguely she wondered if he would tell her about them all, or if some of them were too secret or too painful. She knew well enough how that felt, and so she made another promise to never push him on any of them. She had the faith that he would reveal everything to her eventually. Just as she herself had faith that one day she would be able to be completely honest with him and keep nothing hidden inside. Neither of them were ready yet. She knew that without even asking him, and she knew that he knew the same from words he had spoken in the past. I can tell you don't want to tell me everything, and I won't push you on it, but don't promise me. Don't lie. What are you thinking so hard about? Rob's amused voice interrupted her thoughts, and she instantly brought a smile to her face for him. Nothing in particular, she told him, noticing now that he was fully dressed, only his traveling cloak and furs left for him to put on. Are you leaving now? She asked him, and he nodded slightly, approaching the bed. Mercilla sat herself up, drawing the furs closer around her as there was a slight chill in the air. I'll have them come and set a fire, and bring you hot water for a bath, Rob told her, perching himself on the edge of the bed. She thanked him, scooting further towards him as best she could. He leaned into her, his hands cupping around her face to encourage her lips to his. Mercilla didn't really need his encouragement. She imagined she would always be glad to kiss him. I will be back before you know it. Stay warm, he smiled, and she nodded her head. And you, she returned, stay safe. It was his turn to nod, before he pecked at her lips once more before moving away from her and going for the door. He turned back once more as he opened it, looking as though he wanted to say something else. His eyes were fixed on her for a long moment, and the intensity of his gaze made her almost shift uncomfortably. In the end he said nothing else, merely inclining his head to her and smiling once more before he slipped from the room and closed the door behind him. Mercilla sighed heavily and dropped back down against the pillows, her hands coming up to her head and the strangest desire to laugh taking over her. Here she was, lying in Rob Stark's bed the morning after their wedding, missing him already. Her mother would have a fit. She clasped her hand over her mouth to hide her smile. What in the name of the gods had gotten into her? My queen. Lady Stark's amused tone hailed her as she walked down the hallway, and Mercilla turned and smiled at her. I think it will take me a little while to get used to my new title, she told her good mother honestly. I don't doubt it. I remember turning from a Tully to a Stark. It took a good deal of getting used to, but I would not change it for anything now. Lady Stark smiled slightly wistfully, and Mercilla would not have to be a clairvoyant to know she was thinking of her late husband. Mercilla was wary of saying anything else, not wanting to pull her from whatever fond memory she had found herself immersed in. Her black clothing was back in place today, and Mercilla wondered if she would ever wear real colors again. She had looked lovely in the blue, but it too had been dark and almost mournful. Do you have much planned for your day? Lady Stark seemed to snap herself out of her daze, an expectant smile on her face. I was returning this to the library. She held up the book in her hand, and I thought I might find Bran there. Then I suppose I really ought to write to my mother about the wedding, though I imagine I will be wasting my time. Mercilla knew she had likely said too much, and with too much bitterness, but Lady Stark merely smiled sympathetically at her. It can be hard for a mother to see her children grow up, to know they have passed under someone else's protection, Lady Stark told her, and Mercilla just about resisted rolling her eyes. I don't doubt that is how many mothers feel, Mercilla conceded, but that is not my mother. Forgive me, she shook her head, you do not need to hear any of this. I will hear anything you want to tell me. We are kin now, Mercilla, Lady Stark said kindly but insistently. I appreciate that very much, she smiled, but today is not the day. I woke up in a rather joyous mood and I do not want to sour it. Lady Stark smiled at that, reaching her hand out to pat Ursula reassuringly on the shoulder. You only need find me, should you ever need to, she promised, squeezing Ursula's shoulder lightly before letting go. Thank you, my lady, but I rather think there are others who need your ear more than I'm, Ursula said pointedly, catching sight of Arya over her good mother's shoulder. Lady Stark turned her own head, and a distinct sigh came from her. Arya looked murderous as ever she did whenever she caught sight of Ursula. They had not spoken since the incident in the crypts, but Ursula could still feel the waves of resentment crashing towards her each time they were in one another's presence. She will get there eventually, Lady Stark assured her in an undertone. But until then I ought to avoid conflict, Ursula said wryly, and Lady Stark smiled sympathetically. I ought to go and speak with her, again her good mother said heavily, and Ursula nodded. Do not push her on my account. I came here expecting everyone to feel for me the way she does. Believe me, reality has been a welcome surprise, Ursula said, and Lady Stark smiled slightly, shaking her head. You're a sweet girl, Ursula, she said. I will not keep you any longer. Enjoy your time with Bran, and good luck with writing to your mother. You know where I am. I do, Ursula agreed as her good mother turned away from her and made her way back towards the entrance hall where Arya was still glowering. Against her better judgment she lingered where she was for a moment, watching Lady Stark approach her younger daughter and place an arm about her shoulders. Arya promptly shook it away, and Ursula could distinctly hear raised voices, though she could not hear what they were saying. Likely that was for the best. She sighed heavily and decided she had lingered too long already, turning away from Lady Stark and her daughter and continuing on her journey to the library. The door was ajar as usual when she arrived, and she slipped around it, making her way at once down the row of books that led her right to Bran's usual desk. He was there as she had expected, and he had clearly heard her coming as he turned his head and smiled at her. Good afternoon, my queen, he grinned, and Ursula couldn't help but return the gesture. Enough of that, she mockingly scolded him, coming to take the seat next to him. What brings you here? Bran asked her, and she laid the book she had brought on top of his desk in response. All finished, she told him, and he smiled again. Did you enjoy it? He asked her, and she nodded her head in response. Very much so. The description was so vivid. The only one I could not bring myself to read about was the White Walkers, she reported to him. You are afraid of them? He enquired, raising his brows. I do not think anyone is overly fond of them, she rolled her eyes, and he chuckled. There is nothing to fear from the dead, that's what my father always used to say, Bran told her, and she half smirked at him. Bran, I have no doubt whatsoever that your father was a very wise man. But on this occasion I think he may have been mistaken. I think there is much to fear from an army of walking dead, she said, and he laughed again. Robb took issue with that one too, Bran said, and she smiled slightly at the mention of her husband. I don't doubt it, not after what he had to face, she said, vaguely wondering if any of his scars had been inflicted by the walkers. Indeed, he agreed, his eyes searching as he pondered her for a long moment. What? She asked him suspiciously, and he shook his head. Nothing, he said quickly, you just seem a lot more relaxed recently, that's all. I suppose I am, Ursula conceded, things got better, just as you said they would. Bran grinned at that, a trace of smugness in his features that had Ursula rolling her eyes again. I'm glad, he said seriously, and she smiled at him. Thank you, she returned, and he nodded his head, reaching out for the book she had brought back and turning it in his hands a few times. I could find something else for you if you like, nothing with White Walkers, I promise, he grinned at her and she laughed lightly. I'd like that, thank you, Bran, I need something to occupy me while Robb is away, she smiled, moving her eyes to see what books he had piled up in front of him. I see medicine is your next area of study, she commented with a raised brow. I'm just interested, that's all. Mostly just the remedies. It's amazing what can come of a few handfuls of leaves, Bran said. I'm sure it's fascinating, though not something I have ever given much thought to, Ursula told him honestly, and he smiled faintly. Fables of House Stark. Bran offered her a book from the shelf behind him, and she reached out for it at once. This looks like a hefty read, she observed, weighing the book in her hands. There are a lot of legendary Starks, Bran said teasingly, and she smirked at him. Allegedly, at least, she said pointedly, and he laughed at her. You know many myths and legends are more than likely to have their basis in fact, Bran informed her as she inspected the first few pages of the book. Is that right? She said vaguely, her eye already caught by the beautiful illustrations. Of course, he answered. 1,000 years from now the tale of Robb and the dragon will be legendary, and yet we know well enough that it happened. But 1,000 years from now the story will be exaggerated beyond recognition, Myrcella countered, closing the book with a snap. The dragon will have 2 heads, or become twice the size, and Robb will have wrung its neck with his bare hands. Myrcella raised a brow and Bran laughed at her. Then the answer is simple, he said. When you are reading the tales from the book you only need think of the simplest way it could have happened. That way you will likely be much closer to the real truth of it. If someone reads Robb's tale that way in 1,000 years, then they will likely say he decapitated an overgrown lizard with a great sword, she said with a raised brow, and Bran dissolved into laughter once more. I do not believe I have an answer for that one, he chuckled at her, shaking his head slightly. Well, if I have stumped the great Bran Stark, who is known to be the font of all knowledge, then I know I have achieved something with my day, she smiled at him. And now, I will take this and leave you in peace. She indicated the book, and he inclined his head to her. Enjoy the rest of your day, he said, as she rose back up to her feet. The same to you, she inclined her own head. I will no doubt see you tonight at dinner. It felt strange, retiring to different chambers after dinner. She still thought of them as Robb's chambers, and being in them without him made her feel slightly on edge. Likely she would soon get used to it. It had taken her a time to get used to her own chambers when she had first arrived at Winterfell. Over the course of the day she had moved everything she owned into the space she would now be sharing with her husband. Husband. She still couldn't quite get her head around that, and it made her feel a little bit giddy every time she referred to Robb by that title in her head. Myrcella closed the door of the chamber firmly behind her once she was inside, her eyes moving to the fire in the grate and seeing that it was burning well. She would still add more wood before she went to sleep, but it was perfectly warm for now. Slowly she began to loosen the ties of her dress, her eyes finding Robb's robe slung over the screen that hid the bath from view. She had borrowed it this morning, having realized that she would look utterly ridiculous retreating back to her old chambers in her wedding dress to retrieve her normal clothing. It had been so soft and warm, made of a thick flannel material that was far more substantial than her own robe. She bit her lip and wondered if he would mind her wearing it while he was gone. There was no reason she could think of why he wouldn't allow her to. He had said that he wanted her to share this space with him after all. She slipped out of her dress and swiftly dropped her shift before pulling the robe down and wrapping it around her. Gods, it even smelled like him. She inhaled deeply before gathering up her dress and shift and tidying them away properly before settling herself at the vanity to take the pins out of her hair and brush it through before bed. Once she was done she picked up the book she had acquired from Bran and retreated to the bed. She snuggled down in the furs, propping herself up against the pillows before opening up the book. It was difficult to focus on the words, as thoughts of Robb kept drifting into her head. She wondered what he was doing at this moment, whether he was still riding or if they had stopped to make camp for the night. Gods, she hoped he would be warm enough. She herself couldn't help feeling that the bed was a little colder than it had been the night before. Colder without his presence. She knew it was preposterous, that with Robb's robe and the mountain of furs on the bed she would be more than warm enough. Her hand went to the side of the bed where he had slept, and she sighed heavily. How could she miss him next to her after only one night of it? It was no good. She couldn't concentrate properly on the book to enjoy it, and so she snapped it closed and reached over to place it on the bedside table. Again, she looked towards the fire and decided she couldn't be bothered to get out of bed again to toss a few more logs on it. Likely she would rue it in the morning, but she would deal with that when it came. She snuggled further down into the furs, rearranging the pillows so she could lay comfortably. Myrcella tugged Robb's robe further up around her and sighed in contentment. She closed her eyes and determined to sleep, doing her best to ignore the absence of his warm body lying next to hers. Chapter 14, 12, The Inside Man. Notes. Hey guys, I'm away from home and have limited use of Wi-Fi, so forgive my lateness with this chapter. Big thanks to everyone who has left a comment or kudos. Sorry this note is so quick. Hope you enjoy the new chapter. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Robb. They thundered into Torrens Square, 200 strong with the direwolf banners displayed proudly at the helm. Rob followed the banner bearers, leading in the rest of the men as they rode down the main street of the settlement. Some of the townsfolk called out cheerily, others looked distinctly wary as the royal party rode past. As well they might, Rob thought wryly as they drew ever closer to the main keep. The gates were open to them and they galloped right through, slowing as they came into the main courtyard. Rob's eye sought out the main doors, seeing Master Hellman stood at the foot of the steps with several members of his household. He thought the man looked slightly apprehensive, seeing him wringing his hands slightly. Rob dismounted, Billy there at once to take the reins of his horse. He thanked him before striding towards the welcoming party with the small John on his right shoulder. His friend had insisted on coming, and Rob knew that part of him was hoping for a fight. Your Grace, Master Hellman and those stood with him all dropped down to one knee, and Rob sighed heavily. Even after all these years as king he still found it intensely uncomfortable when people fell at his feet. Rise, he said tiredly, we shall speak inside, my men will amuse themselves for a while. John, with me. He inclined his head to the small John, who nodded in response. Of course, Your Grace. Master Hellman bowed his head, please, allow me to escort you. Rob inclined his head in agreement, managing a small smile for the master. He turned at that, leading the way up the steps and into the keep, Rob and the small John following closely behind him. Master Hellman led them to a small but comfortably parlor, calling for wine and insisting they sit themselves down. Rob didn't argue with him, he was exhausted from the riding of the past few days and of the lack of sleep that accompanied staying out in the open. He would be glad to rest in a real bed, even if it were only for a few nights. Thank you, he said to the serving girl who offered him a glass of wine. She promptly flushed scarlet and curtsied to him before backing away hastily. Rob resisted rolling his eyes, instead taking a long sip of wine before turning his attention to Master Hellman. Your walls are strong, he stated, and the man inclined his head in agreement. Your stores are kept within the walls, Rob continued, how is it that they are being so easily looted? Master Hellman looked distinctly awkward at his question, clearing his throat slightly before he answered. It is a question we have asked ourselves, Your Grace, and the only way we have concluded is that someone within the keep must be helping the looters, Master Hellman reported, and Rob sighed heavily, sharing a look with the small John. 2 of your guards were badly beaten, where were they found? Rob asked. The lake gate, to the south of the keep, he answered, and Rob took another sip of wine. Then I think you have your point of entry, the small John said wryly, raising a brow in Rob's direction. Indeed, my lord, Master Hellman agreed, and we have made several inquiries but all have led nowhere. If anyone knows anything about the looters, they are keeping their mouths firmly closed. Perhaps their tongues would be loosened if their king were to speak with them personally, the small John suggested with a slight smirk. Indeed, my lord, Master Hellman said again, inclining his head in agreement. I think I will take a walk around the town, stretch my legs after such a long ride. Would you join me, John? Rob tilted his glass towards the small John. It would be my pleasure, Your Grace. He tilted his glass in return and they shared a knowing smile. Master Hellman looked rather nervous as they both drained their glasses and set them down before rising up from their seats. We will return to the keep in due course, Master Hellman. Rob allowed him a small smile and inclined his head before leading the small John out of the parlor. What do you think? His friend asked him as they walked back through the keep towards the main doors. I'm thinking someone within the keep is indeed behind it, and I would wager they are making a decent profit to risk their position here, Rob answered, and the small John nodded his agreement. So you think they are already selling the looted goods? He raised a brow, and Rob nodded his confirmation. I think we ought to take a turn about the markets, see what they have on offer. Rob smiled grimly and the small John clapped him on the back with a chuckle as they emerged from the keep. It's not quite dragons, he said as they descended the steps, but I am overdue a little adventure in my life. Rob couldn't help but laugh at that, shaking his head as they walked in step across the courtyard and towards the main gates. I think this may be more mystery than adventure, John, but perhaps your imagination will serve you well, he commented, his friend snorting in response as they passed under the gates. Either small John mused, or perhaps I will find me a pretty maiden at the market. Little changes about you, Rob commented amusedly, inclining his head to an old man who had called out a greeting to him. You cannot pretend you have not had your share of women, the small John responded, and he smiled wryly. I am a respectable married man, Rob told him, and the small John cackled in response. Married, he snorted, and Rob shoved at his shoulder. Watch your tongue, Rob said in a falsely scandalized tone, only to have the small John shove his shoulder right back. Will you have me arrested for treason? His friend teased him, and he glared at him. Don't tempt me, Rob said pointedly, but the small John merely grinned. Serious face now, Your Grace, we are approaching the market, he said, and Rob rolled his eyes. Just wander through, keep a sharp eye for anything suspicious, but at least try and be discreet, Rob murmured to him as they joined the crowd at the markets. It wasn't horrendously busy, but there were enough people milling around to make sure that he and the small John could blend in. The only thing that ever gave Rob away was his coloring. He looked far too much like a Tully to be anyone but Rob Stark. He considered pulling his hood up, but decided that that would look even more suspicious. By now word would have spread through the town that the royal party had arrived, and so he left it down and tried not to make eye contact with anyone. He didn't see anything that aroused his suspicions, but his eye was caught by a stall selling fur stoles, hats and gloves. A slight smile played on his lips as he thought that perhaps he could take Ursula back a gift. Likely it would only make her roll her eyes, but he also thought she would find it amusing. A moment Rob inclined his head towards the stall and the small John nodded his agreement, following him through the throng of people until they reached the store. Your Grace, the woman tending it dropped into a curtsy at once, and Rob wished that she would hurry up and stand straight again. He did not need to draw unnecessary attention to himself. Please, miss, there is no need, he said insistently, and she rose back up with a slight blush. What are these made of, rabbit? Rob enquired, touching his fingers to a pair of light grey gloves which looked dainty enough to suit Ursula. Your Grace, she confirmed, and he nodded slightly. When winter really set in she would no doubt need something more substantial, but these would do nicely for now. How much? He asked the woman. 6 silver, Your Grace, she answered him, and he nodded, reaching beneath his cloak and into his doublet to pull out his coin purse. He loosened the strings and tipped some coin into his hands, counting out 7 stags and returning the rest to his purse. 1 extra for your trouble. He tipped the coin into the woman's waiting hands and her blush heightened. Thank you, Your Grace, I will wrap them for you, she stammered out, lifting his chosen purchase and wrapping them in a sheet of thick parchment. Do you have a preference of color, for the ribbon? She asked him expectantly, and he cast his eyes over the assortment she had. Green, he finally said, thinking about Ursula's eyes. Very good, Your Grace, she said, wrapping the ribbon around the package and tying it neatly. Thank you, Miss. Rob inclined his head to her as he took the wrapped parcel from her and tucked it beneath his cloak. You're most welcome, Your Grace. She bobbed a slight curtsy and he offered a smile before turning away. I suppose you ought to take the Queen a gift, since you deserted her the morning after your wedding, the small John commented as they walked on. Rob agreed, though I would hardly call it desertion. Believe me, I was most reluctant to leave. The small John chuckled at that, apologizing to a man he knocked shoulders with as they passed through the crowd. Time was you were most reluctant to marry her, his friend reminded him, and Rob smiled wryly. Times change, he said simply, skirting round a group of hagglers at the meat store. And I suppose her beauty has naught to do with it, the small John quipped in a teasing tone, and Rob scowled at him. Her beauty is not just on the outside, he said seriously, she is not the girl I feared her to be. Good, the small John said just as seriously, and Rob smiled properly. I've seen nothing obvious, perhaps we could try the tavern. Rob suggested, and the small John grinned. Now you're talking, Stark. He clapped him on the back and Rob rolled his eyes, turning to head back the way they had come. Hold up, the small John stopped him in his tracks and he paused. What is it? Rob asked him, following his line of sight to a fish stall on the edge of the market. A hunch, the small John said, frowning slightly. I will follow your lead, Rob invited him, gesturing to the store. A young girl, perhaps even younger than Ursula, was tending the store. She didn't seem particularly nervous as they approached, curtsying politely and offering formalities. Rob frowned, hoping that the small John did indeed have a hunch, and not just had his eye caught by the seller. Are these fresh? The small John gestured to a pallet of salted fish. Aye, my lord, caught just this morning, the girl reported to him, and he nodded slowly. Caught where? He asked next, and Rob rolled his eyes, wondering where he was going with this. The lake, my lord, as all the fish is caught, the girl answered him evenly. Interesting, the small John said slowly, how a saltwater fish can be caught in a freshwater lake. The girl's eyes widened at that, and for the first time she looked nervous. Rob's brow furrowed, as he stepped a little closer to better examine the fish. "The keep gets imports from Salt Spear, does it not?" the Smalljan murmured quietly to him, and he nodded confirmation. "Aye, preserved in the stores," Rob said heavily. "Who delivers your fish, miss?" the Smalljan asked the girl, and she shrugged her shoulders. "Many fishermen, my father deals with them, I just sell from the store. People are more likely to buy from a young girl, that's what he says. I don't know who he trades with, I just make sure the fish are shifted," she told them, a slight shake in her voice that had Rob narrowing his eyes slightly. "And where is your father?" the Smalljan asked her, only to be greeted by another shrug. "Can't answer that, my lord, apologies." She bobbed a little curtsy and Rob sighed. "Come on," he murmured, "we are wasting our time here. I'll have some of the men come down and keep an eye on her." The Smalljan nodded at that, before inclining his head towards the girl. "Thank you for your time, miss," he said politely, and she nodded curtly in response. The Smalljan stopped off at another stall nearby to get the name of the girl's father, after which he and Rob made their way back to the keep. Rob found some of the men loitering around the armory and he called them over, sending 3 of them down to the market to keep an eye on the girl and keep a lookout for any other suspicious activity. It would be impossible to tell stolen grains and simple foods apart, but fine wines and rarer meats would be easier to spot. He asked them to be discreet, and told them to stay away from the tavern until they had reported back to him later in the evening. They had agreed with him and set off into the town, leaving Rob and the Smalljan to head back into the keep. His men returned later in the evening when Rob was sharing a drink with Master Hellman, the Smalljan, and several others, in the parlor after dinner. They did not return empty-handed. A middle-aged man was prodded through the door ahead of them, shifting nervously from foot to foot with his eyes darting about the place. "Who is this?" Rob asked, looking expectantly towards his men. "Lorik, your grace," the fishman, one of them answered him, and Rob turned his attention to Lorik. "Are you aware that your daughter is selling stolen fish from your store?" Rob asked him evenly, seeing his tongue dart out to lick his lips nervously. "Alibis from many men, she cannot be expected to know where it all comes from," Lorik said. "She is a good-natured girl, and trusting. Would be easy for some to take advantage of her." "I'm sure," Rob said dryly, "though I am somewhat confused, as your daughter seemed to think that you deal with sourcing the produce, and she merely sells it on." Rob watched as Lorik's face drained of color, seeing the Smalljan smirk out of the corner of his eyes. "I think you were offered a way to make more coin," Rob said, "and I do not think you are the only merchant who sells at the market to be offered such an opportunity. You have names for me, Lorik, names that I would be very interested in hearing. You will write them all down, and I will consider a more lenient punishment." "I cannot lose my trade, your grace, my family relies on me, please," Lorik pleaded with him, meeting Rob's eyes. "The names, Lorik," Rob said softly, and the man nodded his head in defeat. "Oversee it," Rob directed towards the Smalljan. "Aye, your grace," he made to stand up, but Rob halted him, leaning in to murmur one last instruction to him. "We need the name of the man inside the keep, have the men round up the rest of them, but bring that name back to us here," Rob told him, and the Smalljan nodded. "It will be done, your grace," he said. With that he did stand up, gesturing for the men to escort Lorik ahead of him. No one else in the room spoke until the door was firmly closed behind the departing company. "How would you punish him, your grace?" Master Hellman asked him at once. "He can keep his trade, he will need it now winter is coming," Rob said, "but he will pay a percentage of his profit back to the keep until his debt is paid." Master Hellman nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "But how will you decide the amount of his debt, your grace?" he asked next, and Rob smiled wryly. "Well, that all depends on how well his list turns out. I do not want to be sold false tales. If the names he gives us prove to be useful, then the debt will be less. If he sends us chasing the wrong men, it will be far higher," Rob answered, draining his glass of wine. "May we be informed of the extra instruction you gave?" Master Hellman tentatively enquired. "I merely requested that the name of the man conspiring within the keep was brought to me," Rob said, holding out his empty glass to be refilled by the serving girl. He thanked her when it was topped up, and she blushed just as she had done before scurrying away again. "Very good, your grace," Master Hellman said, and Rob could see his eyes suspiciously scanning the rest of the company they were keeping. I wager it will not be long before we have our answer, Rob said, calmly taking a sip of wine, his own eyes casting about the room. 2 of his own men were stood against the opposite wall, and they were well armed. Rob himself wore mail under his doublet, and it had been a long time since he went anywhere without his sword hanging from his belt. One could never be too careful. It was another 20 minutes or so of idle chatter before there was a knock on the door. Master Hellman called for the visitor to come in, and Rob leaned forward slightly in his chair as the Smalljan appeared. "Do we have a name?" Rob asked keenly, and the Smalljan inclined his head. "Indeed we do, Your Grace." Lorik named the steward, Alfred, he reported, and the company in the parlor began to whisper furiously to one another. Rob took a breath, looking towards Master Hellman to see his reaction. He had paled slightly, an almost disbelieving expression on his face. "He has keys to the gates, I presume?" Rob directed towards the master, and he nodded. "Aye, one of the sets. The others are in the possession of myself, my brother, my son, and the captain of the guards. There is one other set, but it is kept locked away in my study," Master Hellman told him. "Where would your steward be?" Rob asked next, noticing that the older man looked faintly disorientated. "In his quarters, no doubt," he answered, and Rob nodded. "Would you like to send your own men to apprehend him? Or would you prefer my men to take care of it?" Rob enquired, and Master Hellman's features suddenly set as though frozen in stone. "My men will take care of him," he practically snarled, "a traitor under my own roof. I could have him hanged for this." "Aye, you could," Rob agreed. Looters stealing from the stores was one thing, but organizing continual robberies and profiting from it was quite another. Not to mention the abuse of his position, and the savage beating of 2 of the town guards. "But first I will see what he has to say for himself. You," he nodded towards one of their company, "fetch enough guards to apprehend him and take him down to the cells. He can have a night to think on what he is accused of, and I will speak with him in the morning. Are you inclined to stay for the outcome, Your Grace? Tempting as it is, I do not think you need my presence any longer. You know my thoughts on the punishment of Lorik. I will leave the rest to you, but do not forget that winter is coming, and these men have families. Punish them by all means, but provision must be given to their families," Rob said. "I am glad to have assisted in this matter. Please do not hesitate to send word and inform me of what you have decided to do here. I am very interested in the outcome." Rob inclined his head as he stood up, outstretching his hand to Master Hellman, who stood up at once and grasped it, bowing his head. "Thank you for your assistance in this matter, Your Grace," he said seriously. "I wish you a safe journey back to Winterfell. Will you leave on the morrow?" "Aye, first light," Rob confirmed, before turning towards the Smalljan. "Make sure you inform the men, and then get some rest." "I know I am more than ready to retire for the night," he instructed him, and the Smalljan voiced his agreement before bowing his head and making his way from the room once more. "Good night, Master Hellman." Rob nodded to him. "Gentlemen," he added, inclining his head in turn to them. "Thank you for your gracious hospitality," he finished, smiling between them all before he turned and made his way from the parlor. He breathed a sigh of relief once out in the hallway, glad that the troubles had been so easily fixed, and even more glad that he would be on his way home come first light. His thoughts strayed to Ursula as he climbed the stairs and walked easily towards his chamber for the night. He could not help but think of her sleeping alone, and his mind wandered to how soft and lovely she felt in his arms. Gods, he could not wait to get back to her, to be with her entirely again and feel her bear against him once more. Just thinking about her was enough to elicit a stirring in his breeches, and he swallowed hard, trying to think about something else. Anything else. He let himself into the chamber that had been set aside for him, knowing just from an initial glance that it was the finest guest chamber in the keep. He eyed the desk in the corner and crossed to it, not feeling quite ready to sleep just yet. He decided to write to his wife. His wife. It still felt strange to associate that title with her. For so many years she had been his unknown and unwanted betrothed. Now she was his wife, and though he could not claim to know everything of her, he did know enough to be sure that he wanted her. He pulled some parchment towards him and loaded one of the quills set to the side with ink from the pot. For a moment he wavered, wondering how he should address her. In the end he settled on simply writing her name instead of her title. He wrote that he was well and that the trouble at Torrens Square had been dealt with. He wrote that he would stay one night within the keep and then begin the journey back to Winterfell. Back to her. He couldn't help but tell her that he couldn't wait to be with her again, to have her in his arms again. That was not something he had ever imagined writing to her, and yet it all came so easily to him now. Being apart from her, even just for this short time, had made him appreciate just how much of an impact she had on his everyday life. He missed her smile, her voice, her laugh. He missed the way she teased him and the pressure of her hand on his arm as they walked their familiar loop around the gardens. He missed the softness of her skin, the way her fingers traced the scar above the crease in his elbow, her body beneath his, the gasp that left her mouth when he pressed kisses along her neck, her warmth, her glorious warmth, and her even breath against his chest as she drifted to sleep in his arms. Gods! He put the quill down and put his head in his hands. Thinking about Myrcella this way was something he had thought impossible not so long ago. She had captivated him though. Enchanted him before he knew what was happening. He couldn't be sorry though. So long ago, before everything had gone wrong, he had dreamt of having a wife he could be truly happy with. Against all the odds he had found one, and he could not wait to get back to Winterfell to be with her once more. Chapter 15:13, A Queen's Delight. Notes. Thanks to everyone who has left kudos, I'm over 400 now, which is just awesome. So, this chapter is definitely mature. Again, as with last time, if you think I should bump the rating up to explicit, then let me know in the comments. Anyway, hope you enjoy. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. She woke from her slumber to see that it was still dark out. Slowly she moved her head to the side to see that the fire was still burning brightly. That meant that she could not have been asleep for that long. She had not meant to fall asleep at all, she had meant to stay awake so that she could greet Robb when he arrived back. Her hand moved up to massage her neck, which felt stiff from the awkward angle at which she had fallen asleep. She had thought he would be back by now, but there was no clattering of hooves against stones no matter how hard she strained her ears. Slowly she got out of bed, moving her neck gingerly from side to side as she walked to the window and peered out. Nothing. Nothing to see but the flickering of the flames atop the castle ramparts and the odd shadow of a guard passing by them. Myrcella sighed in defeat and closed the drapes. She would go down to the main parlor once more and see if there was any word. If not, she would have to give up and go to sleep. She threw a few more logs on the fire before wrapping her stole around her and making her way from the chamber. Down the hallways she went before descending the stairs and padding her way towards the parlor. She opened the door as quietly as possible, her eyes going at once to the small table next to the door where letters for the family were usually deposited if they came late and were unurgent. There was nothing there, and she tried not to feel disappointed. "You're up late." Lady Stark's voice made her jump, and she snapped her eyes towards the sound and saw her good mother sat in an armchair by the fire with her needlework. "As are you, my lady," Myrcella replied weakly, moving a little further into the room so she didn't appear rude. "Needlework relaxes me before bed. Likely I will retire soon," Lady Stark said with a smile, and Myrcella returned the gesture. "I was waiting up for Robb," Myrcella confessed, "only I fell asleep for a while. When I woke I thought I would come and see if any word had come." She couldn't help but sound hopeful at the end, thinking that perhaps word had come and Lady Stark had already opened and read it. "No word." Her good mother smiled kindly. "If the men are weary then they would likely have elected to stay at Sawin for the night. They will be here tomorrow afternoon if that is the case." "No doubt you're right." Myrcella smiled, trying to hide her disappointment. "I will leave you in peace now, my lady. Good night." Her good mother returned her sentiments warmly and Myrcella backed out of the room again, closing the door behind her. She couldn't help but cast a hopeful look towards the doors of the keep as she crossed the entrance hall. It was to no avail, they stayed firmly shut, and there was no sound of anything out in the courtyard. She sighed heavily and resigned herself to the fact that Robb would not be back until the next afternoon. It was not the end of the world, she had made it through this far, and he would soon be back with her. She bit her lip to hide her smile as she made her way back to their chambers, remembering what he had written in the letter he had sent. She had not been expecting him to write to her at all, and the contents had warmed her heart. Finally she made it back, letting out a slight sigh of exasperation as she closed the door behind her. She supposed there was nothing else to be done but sleep, and so she began to undress herself, tossing her dress and her shift aside before wrapping Rob's robe around her. She had slept in it all week. It helped to settle her when she woke in the night, breathing in his lingering scent to calm her pounding heart. Not all of her dreams were bad. Some were of him, and they made her blush to even think of them. They were exhilarating, and often caused her to wake with her stomach clenched in knots and a feeling like fire between her thighs. It was a sin to be wanton. That is what her scepter had always taught her. Women should not lust for their husbands, merely do their duty by them in the bedchamber and bear them children. Well, Ursula thought, whoever decided on those rules had obviously never come across a man like Rob. She shuddered slightly, tying his robe a little more tightly around her before she went to the fire once more and tossed on as much wood as it could take. As she straightened up she heard the opening of the door and she whirled around at once, her heart beating wildly in her chest. It calmed somewhat when she saw who had entered, her lips smiling at once at the sight of her exhausted-looking husband. His eyes seemed to brighten on seeing her, a wide smile stretching across his own lips. "It seems like I have returned just in time," he said, his gaze almost wolfish as he looked her up and down. His eyes on her made her shiver, but not at all in an unpleasant way. "Indeed, I was just about to retire for the night," she told him. "I had just about given up on you. Your mother thought you might stay at Sawin. Did you just get back?" "I didn't hear a thing. Only a few of us rode back. The rest have indeed elected to stay at Sawin," he explained to her, depositing a wrapped package onto the desk before making to remove his cloak and furs. Here Ursula crossed quickly to him. "Let me help. You look utterly exhausted. Perhaps you should have stayed at Sawin with the others." He hummed in response as she draped his furs over the back of the chair before unclasping his cloak and laying it aside. "Perhaps you're right, wife," he growled, snatching at her upper arms and pulling her against him. "But that would have meant spending another night in another bed that was not shared with you," he continued, his words seemingly making her melt against him. "You missed me," she whispered, letting her own hands run along his chest and settle on his shoulders. "More than I imagined," he whispered back, clasping his arms around her waist and bending his head to crash his lips against hers. She held on more tightly to his shoulders as the force of his kiss almost had her staggering backwards. He held her fast though, somehow maneuvering her back towards the bed as their tongues tangled in a delicious dance that had a slight moan escaping the back of her throat. Rob's hands found the tie of the robe she was wrapped in and her stomach clenched, her thighs twitching slightly of their own accord. He pulled his lips from hers in the next moment and she wanted them back at once. He merely grinned down on her, toying with the tie of the robe. "This looks familiar," he said, his voice dripping with unmistakable lust. "You ought to claim it back quickly." "I have grown rather fond of it," she replied breathlessly, and he grinned wickedly. In one swift move he tugged it loose before shoving her gently so that she toppled back onto the bed. She lay there breathlessly while he hurriedly took care of his own clothing, biting down on her bottom lip as he pulled his tunic up over his head and tossed it aside. When he moved to unlace his breeches her thighs seemed to twitch again, unbearable heat pooling between them. This time she didn't look away as he released himself, exhaling slowly as he revealed his hardened length. By the gods, had that really been able to fit inside her? He came closer to the foot of the bed when he was fully bare and Ursula's heart pounded, her hips involuntarily raising up from the bed slightly. Oh gods, if she hadn't known it before then she damn well knew it now. She wanted him. She wanted all of him, and she had no shame in admitting it. Her scepter be damned, if being wanton was a sin then she would gladly take her punishment for it when the time came. Rob crawled onto the bottom of the bed slowly, and she shifted herself up onto her elbows so she could inch her way up towards the pillows. "Are you trying to escape me, wife?" he chuckled at her, his hands finding her calves and slowly making their way up her legs as she spread them to allow him to crawl between them. A futile attempt, she teased him back breathlessly. "How easily you caught me, husband. How do you intend to punish me for my insubordination?" He pressed a kiss just above her navel in response, the whiskers of his beard tickling irresistibly. "Don't worry, wife," he murmured against her skin as he kissed his way towards her breasts. "I am sure to think of something fitting." Ursula could only hum in agreement and pleasure as he took one of her buds into his mouth and began suckling like a needy babe. His hands appeared to be everywhere, making every inch of skin they touched tingle in delight. They pulled the rope further away from her, and she was happy to pull her arms free of it and rake her nails down his back. He groaned against her breast, one of his hands coming to settle on her hip and rub firmly up and down her skin. Ursula's breathing was ragged in her own ears, and she couldn't help but rock her hips up towards Rob. The ache between her thighs was begging to be relieved, and as incredible as his mouth felt on her breast, it was not enough. It was not nearly enough. As though reading her thoughts, he abandoned her breast, kissing between them before he kissed down lower. Ursula wasn't entirely sure what he was doing, but her breathing was too ragged to form words. She lifted her head slightly as he kissed just above the most intimate part of her. Almost as though he sensed her eyes on him, he lifted his head, as he wrapped his hands around her thighs. "Rob," she breathed questioningly, her chest heaving. He didn't respond with words. He responded by pressing a kiss between her legs, and she inhaled sharply, her hands fisting in the furs atop the bed. Rob kissed her again, and this time his tongue flicked against part of her that made her body seemingly convulse. A gasp and a strangled cry left her mouth as he did it again, unable to stop her hips from rolling up towards him. Rob seemed encouraged, gliding and swirling his tongue against her so deliciously that her head felt like it was spinning uncontrollably. Somewhere she was aware that she was moaning wantonly, and that her hands were scrabbling against the furs and sheets as though they were the only thing holding her in the real world. Because nothing else felt real as Rob continued to lick, and kiss, and suck at the most secret part of her body. Her stomach tightened and her thighs began to shake. Instinct had her pressing them together as Rob drove a pleasure through her that she felt sure would kill her if it continued any longer. He denied her instincts, his hands keeping her thighs firmly apart as he continued to feast between them. Her whole body was twitching now, almost violent convulsions rippling through her as she thrashed against the bed. Her back arched up and an agonized cry came right from the very pit of her stomach and released into their bedchamber as all her tensed muscles suddenly relaxed all at once. Vaguely she was aware that Rob had released his hold on her thighs, and slowly she became aware of him kissing his way back up her body. She lay there dazed, panting hard to regain her breath as her heart hammered in her chest. Her thighs still twitched involuntarily, and little spasms shot through her entire body. Every pore tingled deliciously, as though she had just been shattered into a million pieces and then put back together again. It was incredible. Indescribable. So much pleasure should surely not be allowed. Perhaps that is why Septa cautioned her against wanton thoughts and actions. Surely experiencing such a feeling was too much for one person to take. Ursula closed her eyes momentarily as her head began to clear a little more, becoming aware of her skin being damp across her forehead and between her breasts. She could feel it behind her legs as well, and between her thighs. By the gods, she must look a mess, but Rob was looking at her as though she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen when she opened her eyes again. "How," she breathed, the only word she felt capable of uttering at his moment. He smiled widely in response, running his hand across her brow to push her damp hair away from her forehead. "I promised," he said simply, and she just about managed to smile at him before he leaned down to kiss her. She lost herself in him. Tasting the difference of him and realizing with a jolt that it was because she was tasting herself on his lips. He obviously noticed her moment of surprise as he pulled back, his fingers slowly coming to caress along her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, and she bit down on her lip. "I am not sure how a person is ever supposed to become accustomed to such a thing," she told him honestly, and he dropped a light kiss to the tip of her nose. "I don't think it would be the same, if it were something we were to grow used to," he responded, and she hummed her agreement, nodding slightly. She shifted her body a little in the next moment and felt Rob's hardened length pressing against her stomach. It was enough to make her shudder, the ghost of the pleasure he had just brought her rippling through her body. Ursula swallowed hard, deciding to test her daring. She wanted both of them to experience such pleasure together, and she could think of only one way that could happen. Slowly she pushed against his shoulders, and he frowned slightly but rolled away from her and onto his back as she had intended him to do. Gathering her courage, she sat herself up, still feeling rather shaky from his previous ministrations. Rob was watching her intently as she slowly moved herself so that she could swing one of her legs over him and straddle his lap. She had a perfect vantage point from which to admire his chest from here, and so she decided to do so, letting her eyes take in every inch, every tiny detail of it. Little scars flecked his ribcage, and she hesitantly moved her fingers to press to each of them. Tiltyard. Grazed on a rock at the hot springs. Arrow. He spoke the cause of each as she touched them in turn, without her even asking him to. She moved her eyes to his and let her hand slowly wander firmly up his chest, feeling him exhale deeply at her progress. When she reached the bottom of the biggest of his scars she hesitated. Dragon, she whispered, and he nodded his head. Can I, she asked, and again he nodded, this time sitting up slowly beneath her until he was facing her. Slowly she traced her fingers over each scar. Each scrape of a dragon's talon. Gods, it must have hurt him, but still he had fought on. Fought on and won. They fascinate you, he asked her questioningly, his tone soft but curious. Your body tells stories. Each one a different tale. She ran her hands over his shoulders before meeting his eyes. It makes you more beautiful, my own skin is so dull in comparison, she told him, and he moved closer to press kisses down her cheek. Your skin is flawless, he murmured as he kissed down her neck. Your stories are all hidden inside, hidden beneath this unmarked mystery, he continued, running his hands firmly down her back before moving them to settle on her hips. That in itself makes you beautiful, he finished, pressing a lingering kiss to her shoulder as she sighed happily against him. Ursula bit her lip gently after a long moment of quiet, lifting her head up to meet his eyes again as she raised her hips slightly. He held her eyes as she positioned herself so she could feel his length pressing against her. Slowly she wiggled her hips until she understood where he fit, slowly allowing herself to sink down onto him. This time there was no sting of pain, just an odd stretching sensation which felt neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Rob let out a stifled groan when all of his length was buried inside her, and she could only imagine that it felt good to him. Once she grew used to him being there, she shifted her hips back and forth slowly, feeling a kind of tingling pleasantness from the friction being built up by her movement. Rob's hands on her hips guided her, and she could tell from his darkened eyes and the odd groan that left his mouth that he was enjoying being inside her. For her it felt pleasant, more so the more she moved, but it was still nothing compared to what he had done to her before. Just the memory of it was enough to make her stomach clench, and her nails pinch slightly into his shoulders. She opened her mouth to ask him, but the words wouldn't come. They sounded mortifying in her mind, but he had told her to let him know what she liked and what she didn't like. She bit down on her lip, and summoned up all the courage she had inside her. Rob, she gasped slightly as her next movement took him deeper into her than she had expected. His response was half-grown as the tips of his fingers clenched tightly around her hips. Would you touch me, she asked him, knowing she was blushing. Would you touch me where you kissed me before, she specified, somehow managing to hold his eyes as she requested it of him. He didn't answer with words, he merely moved one hand from her hip and skillfully ran it down her lower stomach until he reached where they were joined. He touched that little bud, that part of her that seemed to hold the key to all her pleasure within it. She hummed her approval, her hips moving that little bit faster as his touch seemed to intensify the pleasure she was feeling at having him inside her. He pressed harder, circling slowly, and her thighs clenched, her nails pinching into his shoulders again as she rocked her hips harder. Her increase of speed seemed to encourage his own, his fingers toying deftly and firmly between her legs as she continued to take him into her over and over ever more quickly. She was moaning before she could stop herself, her head thrown back as her movements became ever more erratic and quick. Nothing was coherent to her anymore, nothing but the feeling of Rob inside her. She was aware of his own grunts and groans of pleasure. She could feel their wet skins licking together as she pressed her torso against his, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck and working her hips as fast as she could manage. One of his hands was still tightly gripped around her hip, she could feel his fingertips digging into her flesh as he encouraged the relentless movement of her hips. She panted against him, every muscle exhausted yet poised for release as his other hand still furiously circled that bundle of pleasure. Gods, she was ready to explode. She was ready for it again, all of her poised and ready to snap at any moment. Oh gods, I need, she cried almost desperately against his ear as black spots began to pop behind her eyes. Her head was spinning again and her body was shaking as she clung so tightly to Rob that she imagined she might be hurting him. She couldn't loosen her grip though, if she let go she would be lost to the abyss. She needed him here to cling to when everything shattered into oblivion again. almost as she thought that she felt it, and she almost screamed out in sweet, relieved agony. Aware of her clenching tightly around Rob, and aware of his own moan of relief in her ear as he pulsed within her. His hands came to tangle in her hair as she buried herself in the crook of his neck and tried to steady her breathing. "Gods," he gasped, clumsy kisses being placed along her hairline as he turned his head towards her. "Gods, Ursula." She could say nothing in response. She wasn't even sure what the correct and coherent response would be. He didn't seem to mind. He seemed content enough to lay his head down against her own and stroke his hands gently through her tangled tresses. Eventually his hands slipped back down to her hips to ease her from his length. For a moment she mourned his absence, before she realized it was foolish. They could not stay joined together, no matter how wonderful it felt. He placed his hands flat on her back and collapsed down against the pillows, pulling her with him. His breathing was still ragged, and she could feel how quickly his heart was beating as she slid one of her hands down to rest against it. Slowly she straightened her legs out and slipped from his body so she was pressed against his side. As though in response he grasped at some loose furs and draped them over them carelessly. "I know what you meant now," she told him quietly, her voice still slightly breathy. He chuckled breathlessly in response, turning his head to press a firm kiss to her forehead. "I only want to satisfy you, as you satisfy me," he murmured against her skin, and her stomach jumped a little in delight. "You are leading me into sin," she said in an amused tone, and she could feel him smile against her forehead. "How so? Is a man not allowed to ravish his wife?" he asked her, and she giggled slightly. "A man may do whatever he pleases, but my scepter always warned me against wanton thoughts," she answered him, and he snorted slightly. "Rest assured, the old gods have no such rules," he told her quietly, "and we were married before them. What happens in our marriage bed is of no consequence to the seven." "Do you really believe that?" she asked him curiously, and he sighed slightly. "I have no idea, the thought had never entered my head before, and if I'm honest, I'm not sure I am at all interested," he told her, and she smiled, clenching her hand slightly in the muscles of his chest. "However," he continued, trailing his fingertips up and down her spine, "I am very much interested in what wanton thoughts reside in my wife's head." Ursula giggled again, biting down on her lip gently before she lifted her head so she could look down on him. "Do you really want to know?" she whispered, and he grinned wolfishly at her. "I would delight to know," he replied, "but perhaps you'd best save them until the morning. I am rather exhausted thanks to you keeping me awake so late." "I am not sure the blame for that can be laid entirely at my feet, Your Grace," she teased him, and he raised a hand to begin twirling a lock of her hair around and around his fingers. Perhaps not. I suppose the gods are to blame for making you so wanton," he said slyly, and she slapped her hand playfully against his chest. "And I suppose your own desires are non-existent?" she questioned him, cocking her head to one side. "When faced with a woman as glorious as you, I am sure any man would crumble and succumb to his desires," he told her, slowly releasing the curl he had wound around his fingers. "You once told me that you didn't have a pretty way with words. Something tells me you were not quite being entirely honest," she said teasingly, and he rolled his eyes at her. "It must be your southern courtesies wearing off on me," he muttered, and she smiled widely at him. "Careful, Rob," she warned him as she settled her head down against his chest, "you will be curtsying next." Chapter 16:14, Honesty. Notes. Thanks for the kudos everyone. Hope you enjoy the new chapter. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Rob. He had woken before Ursula, keeping her nestled against him for a long time before he simply had to move, padding to the washroom adjoining his chamber. Once he had splashed his face with cold water and relieved himself, he padded back out, seeing her still sleeping peacefully. She looked so sweet and small amidst the vastness of his bed, nestled beneath the furs with an utterly content look on her sleeping face. He ran his hand through his hair as he looked at her, remembering the incredible welcome he had received on his return home. His exhaustion had been forgotten the moment he had entered the room to see her standing there with his robe wrapped around her. He could see it tangled up amongst the furs on the bed and he moved to extract it, Ursula stirring slightly as he did so. Thankfully she didn't wake, and he wrapped the robe about his own body before thinking on what to occupy himself with until she woke up. There was no question of him leaving her before she opened her eyes. The gods only knew what would go through her mind if she woke to find him gone. Ursula may be confident and teasing, but he knew that a vulnerability resided within her, and he knew damn well that she was hiding the extent of it. Somehow he guessed that she would feel abandoned and imagine she had done something to displease him if she woke to find him gone. That was the last thing he wanted her to feel, and it could not be farther from the truth. He sighed. It was tempting to slip beneath the furs and press himself against her again, but then he would run the risk of waking her, and he imagined she would be glad of the sleep after their late night. He was used to early starts and surviving on little sleep. There was no reason for him to subject Ursula to it though. In the end he decided to write some letters. Given the wedding and riding out to Torrens Square, he had not had the chance to respond to Theon or John. He decided to do it now, approaching the desk and moving Ursula's gift aside carefully. He would have to remember to give it to her when she eventually woke up. For now he would occupy himself with letter writing, pulling a sheet of parchment from the drawer and rummaging as quietly as he could for a quill and ink. He found what he wanted in the end, dipping the quill into the ink before he began scratching out a reply to Theon. His friend's letter had been mostly full of his usual vulgarity, and Rob knew well enough how to respond to him. John's letter would require more thought, and his mind was not yet fully coherent this morning. When he finished the first letter he lay it aside for the ink to dry properly, pulling another sheet of parchment towards him to write the next. He had barely written "Dear John," when he heard a shuffling behind him. He turned his head to see Ursula clearly waking from her slumber. Her eyes were bleary and confused as she pushed her hair and the tangled furs away from her. She looked confused. Adorably so. She turned her head, her hand patting the space next to her as though she were trying to find him. "Morning," he said softly, and she looked towards him with wide eyes. "I thought you were gone," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "I thought I'd been dreaming." "A good dream, I hope," he said amusedly, seeing a light blush adorn her cheeks. "Very good," she confirmed to him, and he grinned. "What are you doing?" she asked him, as she stretched her body awake. "Writing a few letters, nothing of great importance," he answered her, and she hummed in response, eyeing him for a moment before she shifted up in the bed. "I see you have reclaimed your robe," she said in a slightly irritable fashion, and he chuckled. "Would you like me to pass you your own?" he asked her in response, and she nodded her head. "Please," she confirmed as he got up from his desk and went to fetch hers from where it was hanging behind the door. "You will need a warmer one soon," he commented as he fingered the silk of it, handing it to her when he reached the side of the bed. "No doubt," she agreed with him. Speaking of warmer things, he trailed off, turning back to his desk to pick up the parcel for her that he had set aside. "I have a gift for you," he smiled at her, tuning back to the bed to see her sat on the edge of it with her robe wrapped loosely around her. For a moment he allowed his eyes to linger on the tantalizing roundness of her breasts, which were only half covered in silks. She seemed to catch his line of sight, a light blush coming to her cheeks as she bit down gently on her bottom lip. "A gift?" She raised her brows questioningly after a minute, and he shook his head stupidly. "Yes," he confirmed. "Here, I hope you like it." "I'm sure I will," she said, taking the parcel from him and toying with the ribbon for a moment. He wondered what she was thinking, but before he could ask her she was pulling on it and winding it away from the wrapping. Rob seemed to hold his breath as she carefully unwrapped the gloves, though he began to breathe more easily when her eyes lit up and a laugh escaped her. "Tell me you didn't finally go to the seamstress for some while I was away," he said in an amused tone, and she raised her head and beamed at him. "No, I didn't," she assured him before standing up, leaving the gloves and their wrappings on the bed. "Thank you," she said as she came towards him, her hands coming to lay on his chest. "It was nothing," he smiled, and she looked up at him with an odd expression on her face. "It wasn't nothing," she shook her head. "You thought about me while you were away, you took the trouble to do something nice for me. That means something to me, it means a lot." He had no words to respond to her, so he settled for planting his hands on her waist and bending his head to kiss her. She kissed him back eagerly, her arms coming to wrap around his neck, as she stepped back slightly, ensuring that he took a few more steps closer to the bed. "What are you up to?" he asked her slyly, breaking their kiss and looking down into her mischievous eyes. "Well," she cocked her head to one side, her fingers coming to twist in the curls at the nape of his neck. "I had thought to thank you for my gift." She raised one brow in a perfect arch, and Rob needed no more encouragement to shove her back onto the bed where she lay giggling, a shriek of delight leaving her when he pounced on top of her. "You do realize I am going to be late for council?" Rob said, stuffing his tunic into his breeches as his eyes hunted the room for his boots. He had tossed them aside carelessly the night before, and he was regretting the action now he needed them. Ursula seemed unconcerned as she sat at the vanity in his robe, slowly brushing her hair through with a slightly glazed look in her eyes. He shook his head at her, finally spotting one of his boots and crossing the room to pick it up, finding the other nearby. He pulled them on quickly before grabbing a doublet from the dresser and pulling it on. After fastening it, he moved to his wife and placed his hands on her shoulders. She jumped slightly, her eyes surprised as he met them in the mirror. "Were you as far away as you looked?" he asked in an amused tone, and she smiled widely at him. "On the contrary, I was very nearby," she told him in a teasing tone, and he groaned, leaning in to press a kiss to her cheek. "I would stay up here all day with you if I could," he growled against her skin, peppering her cheek with kisses before he pulled back again. "How long will you be in council?" she asked him, and he sighed, shrugging his shoulders. "I have no idea, hopefully not all morning," he answered her, and she nodded slowly. "Perhaps we could take a walk when you're finished," she suggested. "I could try out my new gloves." "That sounds wonderful," he said honestly, "but Sansa and Oliver are leaving this afternoon, we can't be absent for that." Ursula sighed in response, but a smile soon lit up her face again. "Never mind," she said, raising her hand up to pat one of his that was still resting on her shoulder. "I will be sad to see Sansa go. Do you suppose there is any chance of them coming again before winter?" she asked him hopefully, and he was loath to disappoint her. "I doubt it," he said regretfully. "The first snow has already fallen, and the next one will likely be harder. They cannot travel in such conditions with such young children." "No," Ursula agreed with a tiny smile, "no, you're right, we shall just have to pray that the winter will be a short one." He squeezed her shoulders in response, kissing her cheek once more. "That is all we can do," he said when he moved away, and she swiveled around on her stool to look at him. "Will I see you at luncheon?" she asked him hopefully. "I would expect so," he said as he wrapped his cloak about his shoulders, "so long as council does not go on for too long." She rose to her feet as he fastened his cloak, coming towards him and laying her hands on his chest. "I hope there is nothing serious to attend to," she said, and he placed his hands on her hips and kissed her slowly in response. "So do I," he said when he pulled back, nudging his nose playfully against hers for a moment. "Now I really must go, before you ensnare me again," he grinned at her, and she pressed her lips to his once more. "See you later," she said softly when he let go of her and stepped towards the door. "I look forward to it," he said honestly, seeing her smile widely before he made his way out of their chambers. He could barely keep the smile from his own face as he made his way down the hallways and the stairs, intending to snatch something quickly from the dining hall before he made his way to the council chambers. "Welcome home," his mother's voice halted him before he could walk through the doors, and he turned to smile at her. "Thank you, Mother," he said warmly, leaning in to press a kiss to her cheek. "You seem to be in good cheer," she said in an amused tone. "There is much to be cheerful about," he replied, and she smiled knowingly. "I'm sure Ursula was pleased you came home last night. I think she was starting to worry about you," she said. "She is perfectly at ease now," Rob told her. "We both are." His mother smiled again at that, coming to his side and taking his arm. "Good," she said, "you can escort me to breakfast, since you seem to have forgotten your wife." Rob knew that she wasn't chastising him as her tone was teasing, but he knew well enough that she was wondering where Ursula was. "She is still getting ready for the day," he told his mother, "and I have council to attend to, so I came ahead." His mother hummed in response to that as they walked the length of the dining hall up to the top table. Rob was vaguely surprised to see that the rest of the family were still there. Seemingly he was not the only one who had risen late this morning. "Morning," he smiled brightly as he moved to take his place. All but Arya responded in a similar fashion. His younger sister merely muttered her greeting before staring moodily at her breakfast. Rob caught his mother's eye, and she just shook her head and rolled her eyes at him. He huffed irritably, guessing that words had been spoken in his absence. He just hoped that none of them had been directed towards Ursula. Arya dropped her fork down in the next moment, letting it clatter against her half-full plate before she stood abruptly from the table and marched her way down off the dais. Their mother opened her mouth, no doubt to call after her, but Rob lay his hand on her arm and shook his head slightly. "What happened while I was away?" he asked quietly, his eyes following Arya's progress out of the dining hall. Nothing in particular, his mother sighed. She didn't go near Ursula if that's what you're worried about. I'm worried about all of it, Rob said irritably. It cannot keep on like this. He dropped his half-eaten bread roll down on his plate, and glared at it as though it were the cause of all his problems. Arya just needs a little more time to adjust, his mother said soothingly, and Rob shot her a look of disbelief. Everyone else has managed it just fine, he practically growled. I have had enough of this. She is a grown woman and it is high time she started acting like it. With that he pushed away from the table and stood up. Where are you going? His mother asked him in an almost fearful manner. I meant what I said, he replied. I have had enough of this. It stops now. Don't do anything rash, his mother almost groaned at him as he strode down from the dais and made his way towards the doors. Ursula made her entrance as he made to leave, her welcoming smile faltering slightly as she no doubt took in his irritable expression. Has something happened? She asked him at once, her eyes wide. Nothing for you to worry about, he said in response, noticing a few serving girls glancing in their direction from the corner of his eye. You look tense, Ursula said knowingly, and he gently clasped his hands around her upper arms in response. I'll be fine, he soothed her, I just have some matters to attend to. I thought you were going to council, she frowned up at him, and he sighed heavily. I will just have to be late, some things are more important, he said, to which her frown only deepened. What? She started, but he leant in to kiss her before she could ask any more. The two serving girls had gone from glancing at them to whispering behind their hands, and he did not like it one bit. Not now, he whispered against Ursula's lips when he pulled away, flickering his eyes towards where the two were gossiping and hoping she understood the gesture. Her own eyes glanced in their direction, and she sighed, nodding her head slightly. Not now, she agreed quietly, and he pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead before he let her go, sidestepping her and striding out into the entrance hall. He made his way swiftly outside, assuming that Arya would have gone out to the tiltyard. Across the courtyard he went, his mind so distracted with thoughts of what he would say to his stubborn little sister that he wasn't looking where he was going properly, bumping into someone as he rounded the corner into the alleyway. I am so sorry, he apologized at once, steadying the woman he had knocked into, but swiftly releasing her when he saw it was Ada. In a hurry, Your Grace, she asked him in an amused tone, smoothing her hands down over her belly. His eyes were drawn to it then, seeing between the folds of her cloak that her stomach was rounded. Congratulations, he said, blinking stupidly for a moment before he raised his eyes back to hers. You seem surprised, she almost laughed. Tom and I have been married for well over a year. Of course you have, he shook his head, smiling slightly. The time has just gone by so quickly, that's all. I haven't seen you, not really. She smiled back at him, an almost regretful look in her eyes. Are you happy? She asked him quietly, and he swallowed hard, slightly taken aback by her question. Mostly, he told her honestly, and she raised her brows. What's the problem? She asked him concernedly, and he sighed. Arya, he said irritably, and Ada bit down on her bottom lip as though she were afraid of her next words. Because of the Queen, she asked him tentatively, and he nodded his head. She will not accept Ursula, she will not even give her a chance, he told her in a frustrated manner. She sounds like someone I used to know, she said pointedly, and he smiled wryly at her. Yes, I know, I was a stubborn fool, but I have admitted to that. Arya, she just won't, he practically growled the last words, and Ada looked at him in a sympathetic manner. You're her brother, she smiled at him. Doubtless she is worried about you getting hurt, or about you being miserable. Don't get angry with her, just talk to her and listen to what she has to say to you. Stay calm, and explain your own feelings. I think perhaps you both just need to be honest with one another, then perhaps this tension between her and the Queen can start to fade. Thank you, Ada, Rob said sincerely. He had no doubt that if he hadn't bumped into her then he and Arya would have likely just ended up shouting at one another. They still might. But at least with this approach he might actually have some hope of getting at least some of his inner feelings through to her. What are friends for? Ada smiled back at him, and he took her hand for a moment, squeezing it lightly before he let go. I wish you every health and happiness, he told her, looking her dead in the eye. Her smile widened at that, and she inclined her head to him in response. Thank you, Your Grace, she said happily, before she squeezed his forearm lightly and set off on her way again. Rob did the same, straightening his doublet before marching down the alleyway to the tiltyard, telling himself over and over to remain calm no matter what Arya threw at him. Arya was savaging a training dummy when he arrived, and he sighed heavily, slowly walking towards her and stopping a safe distance behind her before he spoke. "Arya, come and sit with me a moment," he said firmly, and she stabbed her sword firmly through the dummy where the heart would be and turned to face him. "Why?" she asked him defiantly. "Because you're my sister, and I want to talk to you," he said softly. "Please Arya, don't make me order you." She glowered in response but nodded her head briskly, to which Rob gestured over to the steps of the armory. They walked over there, and Rob hesitated a moment before he sat down on the steps, seeing Arya do the same. Though she purposefully sat herself as far away from him as possible. "I hate us being like this," Rob told her, staring right ahead instead of looking at her. "I know I may have been a little harsh with you about Myrcella," he conceded when Arya said nothing, "but you were cruel to her, Arya, and you have to understand that she is my wife. She is the woman I will spend the rest of my days with, and share children with. Can you understand why I would rather be happy and content with her than despise her for the rest of my days? How can you trust her?" Arya asked him in an almost accusing tone, and he sighed heavily. "I just do, Arya, I can't explain it," he said. "Listen, before she came, you know what I was like. I was dreading it, dreading her coming and having to marry her, but that was before. I was unfair, and I judged her on her family rather than on her own merit. She isn't like them, Arya. I know you think I have had my head turned by her because she's beautiful, but I thought you knew me better than that. Myrcella is a good person, as much as I wanted to deny that before, I cannot any longer. Please, for me, can you just try and give her a chance? It just reminds me of last time," Arya said quietly, "of Joffrey." Her voice hardened when she said his name, and Rob's fists clenched slightly of his own accord. "What do you mean?" he pressed his sister, hearing her take a long breath. "Joffrey had Sansa fooled," Arya elaborated. "He was polite and charming, and she fell for all of his false courtesies. Then when he had her where he wanted her, he made her life hell. I don't want the same thing to happen again, for it to happen to you." Rob shuffled himself closer to where she was sat on hearing that, hesitating a moment before he wrapped his arm about her shoulders. "No one will ever be able to hurt our family like he did ever again," he promised her, and she leaned into him. "He hurt Myrcella too, Arya. Do not think she escaped just because she was his sister," he said darkly. "What did he do to her?" Arya asked him quietly, and he squeezed her shoulder tightly. "I haven't pressed her for details, just as we never did with Sansa," he replied, "but I know he hurt her. She may not have scars on the outside, but," he trailed off, not wanting to say any more. Not even wanting to think about the emotional turmoil his wife had suffered at the hands of her own brother. "We saw right through Joffrey, remember," he continued instead, and Arya nodded her head. "I could see what he was," Arya said, "but Sansa wouldn't. Even after what happened with Micah and Lady, they would still be alive if it weren't for him, but she thought herself to be in love." Rob cut her off. "She thought she would wed the handsome prince and live happily ever after. She always dreamt of that. We cannot blame her for chasing that dream. Joffrey charmed her well, and she wanted to believe him. She was young and foolish. We have all been guilty of that in our lives. Do you really think that Myrcella is different?" Arya asked him, and he turned his head to meet her eyes. "I know she is," he said. "Certainly, I think I knew she was from the moment I met her, but it took Sansa coming and hearing the story of the doll to make me swallow my pride and get to know her. Judge her on her own merit, Arya, and I promise you that you will not be disappointed." Arya grimaced slightly, but he could see the hint of acceptance in her eyes. "Does she sword fight?" his sister asked him, and he grinned at her. "I think she is more akin to Sansa than you," he said teasingly, "but I am sure you can find some common ground. She is actually very funny. I think you might enjoy her company if you gave her a chance." "I will, for you," Arya said after a long moment of quiet, "if it really means that much to you." Rob smiled at that, and pulled her further against his side, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you," he said gratefully, "it means a great deal to me. After everything we have all been through, I just want a content and happy life with my family, and that includes Myrcella now. She has become more important to me than I thought possible, and I want her to be happy here. I just want all of us to be happy here." Chapter 17, 15, Snow Queen. Notes. Sorry this chapter is a little late folks, I was expecting to put it up at the weekend but I was away from home. Anyway, here it is. Thank you so much for the comments, and to those who left kudos. It is some amazing how much I have, closer to 500 now than 400, which is just awesome. Thank you. Hope you enjoy the new chapter. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. He was beautiful when he slept. Innocent. His brow smooth and his features free of any worry or stress. Myrcella smiled slightly as she looked down on him, her fingers itching to run through his auburn curls. She wanted him to wake slowly to her touch and smile up at her. That beautiful smile, that lit up those beautiful eyes. At the same time she wanted him to stay sleeping, so she could explore every angle of his features. To imprint them on her mind forever. She tore her eyes away from him after another minute, flopping back down onto the bed at his side. 2 weeks she had been his wife. 1 week spent apart from him, and the other spent almost entirely in his presence. She knew which one she overwhelmingly preferred. This past week that he had been here had perhaps been the best of her life. Even Arya had started thawing slightly towards her. It wasn't much, just a few polite words here and there, but it was a start, and it made Myrcella's heart soar. 1 week of seemingly unending bliss. She should have known something would come along and spoil it. An irritable sigh left her as she thought about her mother's letter. It had arrived the day before, and she had put off reading it until she had retired for the night. After reading it she wished that she had just put it on the fire and had done with it. Parts of the letter still flashed fresh behind her eyes, and even dragging Rob to bed as soon as he had come up to their chambers had not managed to erase the poisonous words. Her mother had, as she had expected, disregarded everything Myrcella had written to her about the wedding and her new husband. She had ignored the fact that Myrcella had told her that she was happy, that Rob had been nothing but gentle and kind to her. Do not let him fool you, men can be kind when they want something from you. Remember what I said, you must not weaken, you must never show him that you care. Too late. Myrcella smiled wryly. She had grown to care for Rob even before the wedding, and afterwards it had only grown. He cared for her too. He had told her so, and she believed him, because Rob was honest in a way that she had only ever experienced from Tommen before. Tommen. Tommen was far more supportive of her. His letter had told her how happy he was that she was settling in the north. He told her he missed her, but that it was easier to bear now that he knew she wasn't miserable. Why couldn't her mother be like that? Why was her mother so intent on Rob being a monster and her suffering at his hands? It was almost as though she wanted it to be true. As though she wanted Myrcella to have an awful life. If he strikes you, do not hide yourself away, show them all what he has done to you. Myrcella put her hands up to her head and willed the words away. If the gods are good then you will soon be with child, then you will hopefully not have to endure him assaulting your body any longer. Her mother made it sound as though he was forcing her. Myrcella rubbed her hands over her eyes. Her mother could not be more wrong. Even just remembering the vile words made her want to rouse Rob from his sleep and join herself with him entirely. To lose herself in being one with him, to escape her mother's bitterness just for a little while. She did not endure Rob's assault. She reveled in him bringing her a pleasure that she still had not the words to describe. Her wifely duty in his bed was something that she was more than happy to perform, and something that she was as likely to instigate as he was. Rob began to stir at her side then, and she turned herself over so that she was facing him, and determined to ignore her mother's words. From now on she would write to Tommen, and send the occasional correspondence to her mother. She would continue to tell her that she was happy, and pray to the gods that her words would one day get through to her. Rob groaned slightly, and in the next moment his eyes opened, blinking slowly into the morning sunlight. Morning Myrcella greeted him quietly and he smiled lazily. Was I dreaming, or did last night really happen, he asked in groggy amusement, and she smiled widely before biting down on her bottom lip. It happened, she confirmed, and he wrapped an arm back around her and pulled her back against his chest. Good, he said simply, pressing a firm kiss to the top of her head. Myrcella smiled again at that, clutching herself closer to him, breathing in his scent and caressing him gently. Are you all right? He murmured against her. Not that I'm complaining about last night, he continued, stroking his hand through her hair, but you didn't seem quite yourself. Ursula could have wept with joy at his words. It would have been so easy for him to say nothing, and yet he had noticed something was wrong, even though she had done her best to keep it hidden from him. A letter from my mother, that's all she told him, and he sighed heavily. Ursula, he started awkwardly, and she cut across him to put him out of his misery. You don't have to, she said quickly. I know you don't want to talk about her, and after what she wrote I don't think I want to either. Can we just forget it, please? Whatever you like, he said, though she could tell it was said grudgingly. She pinched her nails slightly into his chest before pressing a kiss above his heart. I won't let her ruin this, she whispered against him, and he pulled her even closer in response. She can't, he said firmly, and she nodded her head, determined to believe him. I think it may have snowed in the night, he said after a long minute of quiet. Perhaps we could all spend the day together as a family. Since you have never really had the opportunity before, why don't we just forget all about being grown up and having responsibilities and just be children for the day? Ursula knew that he was trying to cheer her up with his suggestion, and she was thankful beyond words to him. I'd like that, she told him honestly. I'd like that a lot. Are you sure?